All right, we are live. We'll get going this afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining again. Go ahead and have Nancy start with taking roll.
David Bedey,
Here.
Lance Melton,
Here.
Pam Holmquist, Shane Moujor, Brendan Bedey, Dwayne Iverson,
Here.
Sandra Vasic. Yeah, she's here.
Vasika here.
Thank you. Sorry. Greg Hertz.
Here.
Harold Galt. Tom McGilvery. Manish Fat.
Here.
Kendall Cotton. Sean Logan.
Here.
Dustin Ross. DJ Smith.
Here.
Lou Jones.
Here.
Todd O'Hare.
Here.
Dave Fern.
Here.
Jeremy Horperdahl.
Here.
Cindy Johnson.
Here.
Gordon Olkers.
I am here. Good afternoon.
Rhonda Wiggers.
Here.
Yeah, and I see we do have Kendall Cotton on here.
I'll get him up.
I think I got him. And then Shane is on there too.
Sure, just Old Gilbert's proxy.
That's correct. I'm sorry. My bad.
I can take it off. Excellent.
Sometime Errol Galt phones in too if there's a phone number.
Okay, we can go ahead. Oh, Shane.
There you go. Okay, again, kind of looking at a timeline, we're going to go over today, obviously, reports from the subcommittees, the recommendations that came out of the subcommittees. Looks like there's 12 of them at least. Kind of want to go through those, talk through each one, let the chairs of those subcommittees take it from there. The 29th, or excuse me, the 30th, we have a placeholder, and I think that meeting will just simply be a Zoom meeting, and we'll go ahead and just go over the kind of a finalized report, any other comments, considerations that we may or may not want to put in there. And then on the week of the 15th, the report is due on the 15th to the governor, and we're just working out some scheduling on that as to whether or not the governor will be there or how we're going to do that. It'll be that week. So the goal is to adopt some of these recommendations, obviously, today, and then get them into the report, and then we'll go over the report at the end of the month, probably, like I said, through just a Zoom meeting, probably a shorter meeting at that point, but it'll be more of a formal document that you'll look at and review. So that's kind of the timeline for us. I just want to, before we get started and going through some of these recommendations, I just want to remind folks, and I know you guys have been doing this as you've been going through these recommendations, and you know this, but I just want to reiterate it for those listening. But this is, we are doing here are recommendations. They are not law, right? So we certainly don't want to get hung up on a very fine point in detail that will probably, no, I'll just say that will change in the legislature, right? So as we make these recommendations, as they go to the legislature will certainly have its say in how this bill is formed and how this law is put into effect. And so I guess what I want to do is focus on the concepts and the recommendations more than the finer points of the details. I think they're great to talk about, but these are conceptual, obviously. These will then ideally go to, and we have 3 legislators in the room that will probably be carrying many of these pieces. And so as they develop them and as they go through the committees, as you all know, these things change. And certainly we want to have our input into that, but I just want to be careful we don't get hung up on the minutia, if you will, and lose the concepts. So as we talk about these, I know there's going to be, I hope there's discussion, and I hope there's some thoughts on the good, bad, and the ugly on every one of these, because it's there. But I don't want to lose, for the idiom, I don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. So let's try to just keep that in mind as we go through these. So before we get started, is there anything else I missed? Okay, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Senator Hertz, and he can start walking through some of the recommendations from the local government subcommittees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the first one that we can pull up there is the Utah Truth in Taxation. I'm going in order that they are in your packet in front of you. So as the chairman said, I'm not going to get too far down to the weeds, but I'm available for questions as we proceed through here. Utah has had what they term as a truth in taxation since about the mid-'80s. Utah's got a very good property tax model, which we had it. All their mills float, except they recently passed one that's a fixed mill. I think it has to do with school equalization down there. But so as values change, the budget, those mills float up and down. And what Utah's truth in taxation model truly is let's say a local government has a $1 million amount of revenue for their budget. So the next year, if they want to increase that $1 million, even by $1, they have to have, it's what they call their truth in taxation. They hold meetings in the evening, send out information to taxpayers. And at that point in time, if they want to raise their budget by, $25,000, they have to calculate the mills, let all the taxpayers in their taxing jurisdictions know exactly what their property taxes are going to increase. And that allows them to have much more openness, transparency on their taxes. And there's also a little bit in that model that allows taxpayers to basically petition the local government and to put that out on a ballot, whether they want their property taxes increased or not. That rarely happens down there. So that's kind of the model. What we're suggesting to the legislature is look at Utah's truth in taxation model. A lot of the stuff we have in 15, 10, 420 is somewhat similar. So maybe just look at it, take some pieces out of it, and see if we can make some improvements to 15, 10, 420.
Senator, are there thoughts, comments on that as you guys, a lot of the members run that committee? I see we have no dissenting opinions, so that's always good.
Correct.
So it's 100-0 vote.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I don't want to go through and necessarily take votes, but I guess I would just, by consensus, are we good with this concept moving forward as a recommendation of the governor? If so, then we will go on to the next one.
Thank you. So the next one has to do with tax increment financing. We had talked about this particular recommendation a couple of meetings ago within our whole committee of the whole. So basically what, there's a lot of issues dealing with TIFs, some good, some bad. They do at times increase taxes on local taxpayers. So the items that we need to consider is the definition of blight, the possibility of putting some type of limitations on bonding, review years allowed for the TIF districts to exist. Right now, those TIF districts seem to go on for some time, 30, 40 years at a time. And then also upon termination of the TIF district, that property that would be coming back in to the local taxing jurisdiction would not be considered new property, because the taxpayers have already kind of provided for that. So what that would allow, that would help push down mills and taxes to existing taxpayers. And we did not have any, there is some, the dissenting opinions. There are local governments, economic development organizations. TIF is a major tool for them for their economic development, and it is, but I think, we need some sideboards on it. There are some supporting graphics there. And with that, all these recommendations coming out of the local government interim committee came out unanimously without objection.
I'll open it up for discussion. Other thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, I'd comment on TIFs as well. I spent some time talking to school superintendent, who I believe will address us in public comments, and who did actually an incredible presentation on this that I'm hoping there's an opportunity for folks to see. But if I would share kind of the vision of what's happening in his world, is if you take a school, and let's assume that a school is just sitting somewhere in there, and we'll just say it's equal for this deal. There's 640 houses feeding that school population. And someone points at a field out there that would probably develop anyway. That says we're going to put that field in the TIF and develop another 640 houses. So now the school is going to have the population of both places attending. Well, that school and its operations is going to need things like tuition levies to take care of your special ed students. It's going to need things like bus levies to take care of transportation. It's going to need a lot of these type dollars to be spent. So when that school looks out there to now service what would be, instead of 640 units, 1,280 in my hypothetical, and I believe his is close to this, it might, over a hypothetical, maybe they need 5 tuition mills in order to service that deal. But since they don't get to keep all 5 mills, they need to levy 10 tuition mills on the half that pays mills. Meanwhile, the other half takes those 10 mills, which they thought was going to tuition, but now puts it to the TIF, right? The same thing would occur on bus mills. And so we're telling taxpayers in this non-blighted area, because this would likely develop anywhere, it's not a blighted place, that we are passing a tuition levy, a bus levy. And yet that's not where those mills are going. My understanding that as this continues, there is going to be a lawsuit on this side that says we're lying to taxpayers about this. TIFs have a very real benefit, a very real purpose. There's a blighted area, it's in the middle of somewhere, it's been damaged or down in some way. It brings that blighted area back up, and at some point it returns that blighted area to the tax base. This is not, TIFs where this occurs are doing absolutely good things. In these other areas, if we don't address TIFs, they're going to get addressed for us here eventually, and probably not in a manner that we see very, we like very well, because the courts are going to play here eventually, because we are telling taxpayers one thing and using money for something else. And so I do think we need to look at TIFs. I think this has become critical, and it's not, it always was critical. It's becoming increasingly so. So just my 2 bits, I support this.
The other thing is that the local government committee on the 17th has TIFs on their agenda as well.
Potentially, it might
Your
be a
information.
good thing if somebody's on local government to have this gentleman do maybe a half-hour presentation or something there, because he does probably as good a job of presenting how this directly impacted his school and how it massively changed his mills as anyone else.
Senator Hertz, would you be able to communicate that to?
Yeah, I will. And the Revenue Interim Committee also just is drafting a redefinition of blight also for TIFs.
And I see on the dissenting opinion, it's obviously those probably affecting, but depending on how this legislation was to work out, there may not be that dissenting opinion either. So is that safe thing to say?
Yeah, as Senator Hertz knows, right, it's like this TIF discussion is like one of these great sort of debates. It seems like it's a perennial debate at the legislature. And, we hear from the business community the importance of TIF districts for, revitalizing those areas that are blighted. And there's a certain level of frustration around the fact that there's not a lot of concern or no discussion when you've got a blighted area that there's no activity taking place in there. And then all of a sudden you put a TIF district in and you start to see some economic development. Then the fight is on over the increase in tax revenue. And I think the argument is kind of like a chicken or egg, right? It's like, are we going to, right? It's what's going to happen? What's going to come first? It's an issue that's been discussed ad nauseum by a lot of different interim committees and study committees. I don't know a real answer to it either. We started pulling together a group of business leaders that engage in TIF districts to try to see if there were some solutions that we could find in order to take some of the steam out of the frustration around TIF districts. And a lot of the stuff that we found are very difficult to address. You start talking about shortening the time of a bond. Those entities, those financial institutions that issue those bonds say it's like, you get this too short, we're not going to be able to bond for it. Blight is one of the areas that there is interest in trying to figure out a way that you can define blight. And blight's one of those words that it's in the eyes of the beholder. And there may be some ways that a fellow can define blight that are more appropriate for what it is that we're trying to accomplish in these areas that need extra development and that will ultimately lead to increased tax revenue in areas. So I think depending on how this comes out as far as language is concerned, I think we would be supportive of taking a look at it. I think there's a lot to be learned in understanding how TIFs work, what they're used for and what they're not used for. It is one of the only economic development tools a community has in order to redirect investment in a community in areas that need it. And so I think as we look long term, we need to be careful that we don't, to coin your phrase, right, throw the baby out with the bathwater on this, because it is one of the only important tools that both the business community and the local government has to redirect investment into areas that really need it. So
I think reissuing debt, new debt, in order to extend a TIF district is outside the parameters of what it was intended to be. You know, we just did that in Toole County. Okay, and I don't think that that's the intent of it, is you get to the end of your debt, you issue new debt so you can continue that TIF district. You just block that revenue from them going to local governments. Taxpayers.
Representative Fern, are you, see your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. I think, blight is something you kind of know when you see it. And I think that those discussing a clear definition of blight that would lead to an urban redevelopment map, that's sort of the rules of the road, is on the right track. And this definition of blight is being abused. So I think that there are two components of this that were cleared up. Clear, unambiguous language versus blight. And then secondly, an overall time span that perhaps takes in consideration what a bond would be, maybe after 5 or 10 years of having it, but then, it's over. So perhaps we'd be looking at a 30-year time span. But I think if we cover those two things, we'll solve a lot of the problems that we continually hear in the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Okay, with that, I'm just going to assume we have the consensus to move TIF reform forward as part of the recommendation. I understand there's a lot of details to be worked out there, a lot of issues inside that, but certainly something we all agree needs to be done.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
If I can just add, we try to help our school districts understand this law, and it has become a bit of an indecipherable mess. You got to know not just what's excluded, but it depends upon the initiation date, the expiration date. There's half the 95 mills wrapped into one piece. There's no 95 mills wrapped into the other. The university mill is excluded here. It's not there. I think that what we really need, I sort of get a bad rap sometimes for being opposed to TIFs, and I'm not. But I am opposed to the chaotic way that they have rolled into school district budgets and created confusion and to some degree animosity from taxpayers who sort of get the wake up headache after the TIF has passed and realize that their taxes are going to go up in that particular district, and immediately where they're going to go and where they do go is straight to the school board. Why did you raise my taxes? Well, I didn't. I got a narrower tax base now, and some of it's carved out. So I think that the greatest solution here would be whatever everyone can come up with that's more transparent than it is now, so that we can then say to somebody, hey, look, we all approved this. We all agreed that this was a good thing to go forward, and the cost of doing business means that your transportation levy went up double the rate of inflation this year because a portion of your tax base is temporarily gone. I think that that's really pretty critical. I would love never to have to testify in opposition to a TIF bill or in support of one either.
Me too.
So.
Or carry one.
Exactly.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes.
But if you look, there's periods of peace in the history here. You know, you got some laws haven't changed for 10 years. This one changes every session. 7, 15, 42, 86. But there were periods of time where it's quiet, for like 10 years at a time, then 5 years at a time. And then 2017 on, it's game on. Boom, boom, boom. You know.
And there is, so without TIFs, what a community could do is pass an economic development levy. And basically tell their taxpayers, hey, look, we want to raise $3 million every year to do economic development in our community. You'd be very transparent, everybody know what they're paying for. Unfortunately, right now, that happens indirectly through TIFs, and the taxpayer has no idea how much they're paying on their tax bill to support that TIF district. Lance is right on, a lot of that, and about 50% of the TIF increment is supported with school levies, whether it's the 95 mills, bond levies, permissive levies, et cetera. So it is taking a lot of money away from schools the schools will be getting it, but the other taxpayers are paying more money to fund their schools, and they don't know that. So, enough said.
So I
Yes.
assume TEDs fall under this,
Yes.
Yeah.
under the TED.
I would assume so.
TEDs and TIFs, yes.
Because it's TEDs in the county.
Yeah.
TIFs in the city.
It's an urban renewal district,
Yeah.
and then TIFs are usually inside a city limit, and a TED is outside. Yeah. A lot of terminology there.
I like your idea.
We will move that idea forward then.
All right.
Back to you, Senator.
So next item on the agenda, fairly simple one. Require voter approved levies to sunset after 10 years, except for bond levies. Obviously, they have to last the length of the bond. So the rationale for this is, taxpayers, they're basically items change in their communities. They may not support a particular levy anymore. Something may have a higher priority. So, it gives the taxpayer a little bit more often to look at these different levies that they voted on and reapproved. And so there were no dissenting opinions within the committee, although carrying a bill like this last session, I can tell you the local governments didn't particularly care for it. They wanted a lot of things carved out. Well, carve out my libraries, carve out my safety levies, carve out my road stuff, and pretty soon everything got carved out and there was just nothing left. I'm of the opinion that the voters will make the right choice. They'll look at something and do they want to continue to support maybe recreational type levies over fire and safety levies. And I think they will take a look at it and say, no, fire and safety is much more important to our community now than it ever has been. And maybe our parks and some of our recreational areas may have to fall off and not be as well maintained.
Sika, do you have a comment?
But yeah, is this being proposed to I guess backdate current levies that just got voted in and current levies that are currently in perpetuity, or is it just moving forward?
Would it be any existing levies or I think that's the question.
So I think that would be something that the legislature would have to look at, whether we could reach back and sunset those current levies that are coming forward.
So that had not been discussed then. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I am in favor of reaching back and sunsetting those levies as well, just to have that on the record.
I just have a question. So just an example, you have in Big Fork, we have a stormwater maintenance district, which runs a levy every year for maintenance. And so if you don't maintain it, of course, it's not going to keep up. So how is that? That's a little difficult. And sidewalks, same way. You have a sidewalk maintenance district and all of a sudden it sunsets. You don't have no one plowing the sidewalks. You don't have any seals in the cracks of the sidewalks. That's a little hard for me to take. So just
Those are SIDs.
lighting districts, anything. Well, lighting districts aren't. They are, but really the big ones are like in Big Fork, if the jellyfish needs replaced, which nobody wants to know what a jellyfish is, but it's expensive. And if we don't have the maintenance district to collect the fees through the years, so when that maintenance comes up, then who's going to pay for the jellyfish that keeps the water flowing? That's just want to let everybody aware of that. And sidewalks, same way.
But are you talking about SIDS or are you talking about voted?
Special,
Well, so that,
special maintenance districts, which are
okay, so there is,
every year.
so the special improvement district, special
No,
maintenance,
the one we have in
because a voted levy and a SID sometimes are different. A SID has a special footprint.
yeah.
A voted levy is the entire tax base often. So I think you might be talking about the SIDS.
But I thought our sidewalks, which we're now doing with MDOT,
That might be area.
yeah, a little different.
But yeah,
Anyway, just something.
That might be probably a road maintenance type levy.
Yeah.
I'm still of the opinion the voters will make the right choice to what they want. If they tell you that they don't want their sidewalks plowed,
Then I
guess what? Your sidewalks are not gonna get plowed.
Vote happens in January.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's.
Yeah, but I pay a lot of taxes.
I know.
That's what builds up.
We
Yeah.
have Senator Morjo.
Yeah, that was my question. I was gonna just ask Senator Hertz. So, I mean, right now there's nothing. Is there anything that would prohibit a local government from capping it at 10 years right now for a specific bond levy? If they wanted to do that now, because I mean, it seems like hard and fast type of rule might be an impediment or not be a one size fits all type of thing. So I'm just curious if there's anything that would stop them from doing this right now if they wanted.
Senator Marshall, no, there is not. You can pass a levy for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, or in perpetuity until it's just removed. So, and this, depending on how the legislation is written, there might be an out there that says, hey, look, if voters want to pass a 20-year levy, maybe that's something that's allowable, but just those ones that don't have any sunset on them would have to be reviewed every 10 years.
you have it proactive, right? It's automatically 10 years unless it's passed in a manner that is some other date than 10 years.
I think in the school realm here, and obviously, make a claim for an exception, they'll probably swallow the rule, but I got to make the claim. The state is only able to comply with its obligations under the Constitution because of where school districts are in their spending and their general fund budgets. And where that has gravitated is to an average of 97%. There are only 5,000 kids, I believe, left being educated at a base budget. So the whole theory that a base budget is adequate, I think would be quickly disproven, easily disproven. There are triple the number of kids over maximum, 17,000 in 110 school districts, largely rural districts, who are every year living and dying on the approval of that levy and the underlying taxes over base that go with it that have been previously voted. If it gets sunsetted, what it gets sunsetted is clear back to base. And so you're talking about a sunset that could cause a really catastrophic reduction in funding for a school district that's going to really make it near impossible to defend on adequacy or even potentially equity, because you're going to have high stakes passages and failures. And back in the good old days, until 2008, my career until 2008, I loudly proclaimed the 95% passage rates the day after the regular school levy election in May. And when the Great Recession came along, it dropped down to 70. It bounced and bumped up into the low 80s. And this year the wheels came off and only 50 some school districts chose to run a levy. That's trouble right there. Because when I was at 95%, I had 153 school systems running levies. They're now down to 53 and the passage rate is 50%. So you got big consequences for the state's obligation to provide a basic system of free quality schools if you make a general fund levy subject to a sunset in that manner. As a sign of good intention here, I worked successfully with Senator Fred Thomas to take tech levies and impose a 10-year limit on those levies. We first initiated them back when there was no sunset, and I worked with Senator Fred Thomas, and we drafted legislation that was more modern. It was no longer focused exclusively on depreciating technological equipment, but on paying for software licenses and the way that, cloud computing, things that we do now that we didn't do back when that law was originally passed, and the cost of that progression that we worked on with Senator Thomas was a 10-year sunset. So the levies outside of that general fund operating, even though the courts have always said, yeah, even they count to some degree, the general fund is really where all the litigation has focused over the years. And I think it would be significantly jeopardized under the current circumstances with an average district at 97%. And very few down there at the levels that you would fall if it sunsetted and you had a high stakes no vote.
Senator Hertz, I think one thing when you get to the next one, along with this definition of what fits in each one of them, is really what's going to be the key. And you don't want people to be able to move into a special district just to avoid that sunset.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Senator Morris, do you have another comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last two comments ago were kind of hitting on like my concern with just kind of a blanket, 10-year window. I think there's, obviously we're gonna have more conversations about this moving forward, but I just have concerns for, stuff like education, general health and welfare, certain things that are impacted in those realms where, putting that particular sunset could cause chaos for some of those folks. I get the concept and the purpose behind it, and trying to, have some, tracking of these sorts of things a little bit better. I totally get that and for that, but I just have some concerns on that front. So I really appreciate the example on the education front, because that's kind of where my line of thinking was coming from.
And I think just kind of going back, I mean, the devil's certainly going to be in the details and how this gets fleshed out, right? But I think the concept behind getting the voters more involved in this decision-making process is kind of I guess how I'm looking at what's being presented here in this recommendation. And so if that's my understanding, I guess I'd move that we go ahead and adopt it, but certainly want to hear any other thoughts on it.
So one of the big, the 6 mil levies, we vote on that every 10 years. They came back this year and they said, hey, Senator Hertz, could we please take the 10 years off? Because we passed this every year with large majorities. And I'm just like, no, I think it's the right for the voters just to take a look. You can sell it to the voters. Why do you need it? And let the voters make decisions. And once again, I think voters will make the right decision if you provide them good information on how this benefits your community.
One minor addition, we can't sell them. We can't sell passage. We can't spend any public funds, equipment funds, personnel, time, use of facilities to support passage of a levy election. There's a limited exception that we put into the law in collaboration with Senator Butcher, believe it or not, back in the day, that gives the superintendent and the school board some limited authority, but with no spending, no commercial advertising. It's basically, it allows the elected board to speak in support of the levy that it's asking the voters to approve, and their superintendent when they're not in session. But other than that, there's that 22122 recodified from 22121 by Representative Bedey in the last session, I believe, that has a pretty strict limit and even prohibition on spending resources to promote passage of something.
Representative Fern.
I think we're also commingling a greater problem, and that is we're ready to do a 10-year study on school funding. And perhaps what we're identifying in this discussion are some fundamental problems with our school funding system. Just the mention of most districts are at average of 97%. So figuring out what adequacy is, what the role of the state is very important. I think the second issue is that Lance cited the really drastic change in data of, when I was on a school board and in the School Boards Association, practically every district was passing a levy. But we now have a new problem that why we're here, and that is the disproportional impact of appraisals and property taxes. So I think that will go a long way to get to the heart of this issue if we deal with, mitigation of appraisals, which we'll have recommendations on, and then look at modernizing our funding system. I think that goes along and it almost minimizes the 10-year problem. I think the 10-year, a 10-year request on some issues makes a lot of sense if we take care of the foundational business before it.
Sandra?
Thanks. If folks are concerned that the voters are not going to make the correct decision, I would recommend them look at what Missoula's been mailing out, because even though there is that law on Montana Code Annotated, Missoula's been, even though I've filed complaints, their ballot or their mailer language has been pretty pro levy. So I don't think that folks should be too concerned about local jurisdictions being able to be in support of a levy. And that was just a comment. I'm just a little salty about it.
Again, I think the concept is a good concept to have more voter involvement, even if it became as simple that the default is 10 years, unless you notify folks otherwise, right? Because right now stuff passes and it's not necessarily maintenance. If we can always identify those programs that we wish to have continue, that probably need to continue, because if you quit fixing them, they go away. But there's a lot of stuff that passes that isn't in that category. And I think if a guy said by default it's 10 years, unless you make a argument of why this should be excluded from 10 years. And there would be a lot of exclusions, but at least the argument would have to be made of, hey, this is a permanent maintenance fund for taking care of sidewalks, roofs, whatever it is, we've got to do it permanently. And wait, we're spending some money here to put in some new project, but within 10 years will be complete, no longer needs investment. And so it's the concept of transparency probably requires a time frame, just like sunsets do on general fund at the state. But again, it might not be everyone, and we may have to say it if that becomes a default, unless notified otherwise. But it's certainly a concept we have to consider. Is there a point at which a tax is no longer needed in a given area?
Okay, seeing no further comment, we're going to go ahead and throw that in the recommendations as well.
Thank you. The next item up on the agenda is something that we don't have a lot of data on, and that's special purpose districts and special improvement districts. So the reporting at the state level about those type of districts could be better. And so what we're recommending here is for the legislature to pass a study bill and gather more information on these various type of special districts and look at some type of potential to limit their growth. We have in the past put some limitations on special purpose districts. They got out of control a little bit, so we got some sideboards on those, but there's still just a lot of them out there, not a lot of information on them. In fact, when I was looking at a bill last session, it became aware to me that I believe it's the city of Bozeman bills all their special districts on a separate tax bill versus their standard bill. And so when I was comparing taxes in Bozeman to Missoula, somebody said, hey, Hertz, you forgot this $500 a year I pay on special districts. I go, really? Could you send me your bill? And I was a little bit surprised that they had a special bill. And then I started thinking about, well, maybe that's not a bad idea, because then you know what all your special districts are and what you're paying for them. They're not hiding in that big lengthy tax bill you get once a year that you don't really know everything that's in it. So that's what this is about. This is a study bill, gathering some information as we move forward.
Comments? Fabulous idea. Transparency, more data.
Yeah.
also something local government interim committee will talk about on the 17th.
Oh, okay, great.
SIDs.
Okay, I'm assuming with consensus, we're gonna go ahead and put that in as well. Senator Hertz.
Perfect. Okay. So the next one has modifications to 15-10-420. We've talked a little bit about this, I believe, at our committee of the whole. It's Senate Bill 511. It is basically looking at that as a starting point moving forward. That made it through this. It did not make it through the Senate. It died on the Senate floor, I believe, 25-25. But what that does, and MACO helped draft this legislation too. And what it does, it helps some of our smaller counties and cities that aren't growing as fast, but they still suffered from inflation. So what the gist of Senate Bill 511, when we left it on the floor at the Senate, was it would allow for the full rate of inflation capped at 4%. And then it also basically allows some new growth to come into the city's revenue, but cap the overall growth at 4.75. So some of those that are growing very fast, that new growth would not be excluded from the 15-10-420 calculations and would help to reduce local taxpayers, the tax burden on local taxpayers. So the only adjustments as we went through Senate Bill 511 was to also look at population adjustment growth and also look at elimination of bank nil authority. So those couple of things that we're encouraging the legislature to continue to look at 511 with those two modifications.
Comments, questions?
With the bank, the removal of bank levy authority, is that for counties and cities only, or would it be for schools? The reason I ask is we've got a provision in the school levy area that we did several years ago in one of then Senator Jones's bills, where we allowed districts to look back to the highest amount imposed or authorized in the preceding 5 years. The theory being that when you had a tax settlement come in, for example, or you were able to get a good year on oil and gas, that you were able to take the pedal off the metal, reduce those taxes without having to vote back up from your new lower base. So just more of a question as to whether the intent there would be to tackle this globally or just with regard to counties and cities.
So Representative Jones might be able to answer that better than me. I think he's a little more detailed than 511. I thought 511 was just on cities and counties, or did it dip down in the schools too?
511 was just on cities and counties because schools are formulaically capped at a budget level anyway. Cities and counties, in my terminology, are column capped, right? They have a single column that's capped, which is what caused the population of so many SIDS and outliers. So what happens, 1510, the cap rate of inflation capping created a nightmarish problem because there is no county or city that's running at half the rate of inflation consistently. So what they have to do then, in particular, if you don't have a ton of newly taxable, right? So especially if you're a shrinking county, it causes you all sorts of nightmares. It causes the creation, and I was an alderman for a while. You end up with special improvement districts, you end up with fees, because if you don't have any newly taxable growth, you have no way to deal with the system. If you happen to be one of those fortunate areas, Bozeman's and Kalispell's, those that are growing, you can deal with this, but the rest struggle fairly mightily. And so the concept of 511 had been, look, we've got to recognize that in truth, at some level, you're going to have to grow at the rate of inflation. We put a cap on it, so it didn't surprise you because of 1 year and break everyone. Plus the newly taxable. But again, the newly taxable is different. And I always pick a pipeline because it's easy to talk about. A pipeline doesn't require a lot of services once it's in. A subdivision requires a ton of services, fire, trucks, water, sewer, etc. And so it was some formulaic. And again, the devil's in the details. So when I say these numbers, I'm not saying that they're the right numbers, but it might be 4% plus 70% of the newly taxable that's associated with residential and 30% of the newly taxable that's associated with other categories such as commercial, industrial. Again, you'd have to get the formula right. And if you got the formula right, then when you looked at a rural county, since they're probably having no other growth, they'd be capped at the 4%. If you go to a Bozeman or a Kalispell, they're seeing a lot of newly taxable and a lot of other items coming in. They'd have more flexibility, but it would stop this from becoming the creation of, as an alderman, I was fairly creative at avoiding it. And if you're in Shelby, they feed everything, found thousands of ways around it. You know, there's so many ways around it, but it's creating an immeasurable object. And so it was a way to, how do you have a cap that's reflective of the school budget cap, but do it in a manner that's not punitive, but it does provide some sideboards. Was the thought process here. Now the devil's going to be in the details. You're going to have to get what percentage of what correct, right? Because you're going to have areas, you know, we go to our taxpayers, we say, support the widget factory, support all of these things because they'll buy down your taxes. Do they? Well, in some counties, they didn't so much at Lewistown, for example. There was a tank farm that went in that I'm not sure required really too many new services. Certainly increase the tax base, you know. So can we make it so it's a more thoughtful managed process? 511 will take some tweaking, but 511, it's a way better concept than Tabor. It's a way better concept than some of those other hard caps. It tries to treat an exploding county exactly the same as a potentially even declining county.
Thank you. It certainly doesn't require that the county spend to that level.
No, it's at all.
There's a cap. Representative Fern.
Is there an override mechanism for those couple of those really fast growing counties by voters?
They can vote pass.
I don't, you know, Representative Fern, I don't remember that being in 511, but I think that's something that should be talked about.
Yeah, you could probably vote past it.
The other thing I would suggest is, let's stipulate that this is probably not true, but suppose there aren't alternative ways to raise revenue. Special improvement districts haven't even talked about the and that sort of thing. So let's put those things aside. You know, having a hard cap on inflation is not realistic. If you have 8% inflation and you have a 4% cap, it's simply not realistic. I wonder if it's some sort of perhaps as Representative Fern suggests, it's sort of a relief valve mechanism that would allow for special circumstances. I don't know quite how to define that, but I mean, it absolutely, unless you just said, unless you're willing to accept that in order to continue to provide services at the inflated value, entities are going to automatically shift to special improvement districts or fees or something like that, which is not transparent. You know, I don't know. I'm all over the place on this one, but I think a hard cap creates a problem. By the way, it sounds good in principle, but and when you're in a 2% inflation environment, a 4% cap is meaningless. You're in an 8% inflation environment. It's real money. And as Representative Jones has told me time and time again, you know, if you've got a snowplow and if there's an 8% inflation, your tires are going to cost more next year. Doesn't matter, you know, whether, and if you're capped at 4, I guess you're only going to put 2 tires on.
So potentially you could, but see, you could deal with that devil into details, and those are good questions to bring up. You could say if it exceeded 4% for 2 years in a row or 3 years, then you're allowed a 2% step, but as soon as it's back under, it steps back down. There'd be a number. I don't think you'd want an instant 1-year release because stuff pops around with quick moving recessions, but you could find a way to step it in. You could say if in 2 subsequent years it was X% higher, you're allowed a step up, you know, some manner to allow them to compensate. Because of what happened in the PERS and TERS funds, it cost, which reason the state's listed as billions of dollars with liabilities, we've become fairly cautious about letting stuff move around at crazy amounts because you just don't know what's going to happen in the time. The tax system is slow, right? Just because you have inflation suddenly pop doesn't mean that your housing value or your business, you might be in the middle of the worst recession ever and double property taxes. So I think you could do a relief mechanism. I think you'd want it to be very thoughtful that it didn't react too quickly. Otherwise, you potentially create some unintended harm too.
Well, and I think the impetus of the bill originally was because there was a 2% inflationary time frame and it was far exceeding 4%. And so it became the question of, and I think Representative Furman brings out a good point, if there's extraneous circumstances that require, for some reason, 2-3 times the rate of inflation, then maybe that does need to go to the voter, or however that process needs to take place. But certainly there were some areas that were growing at rates that were somewhat unexplainable. And I would argue that there were also counties that were struggling because they did not have that in the tax bill. That half the rate of inflation was killing them, and it was extremely difficult for them to do anything. And so that also helped them, maintain their budgets at a reasonable pace as well. So
I think something to be noted in the report that this is there seems to be some consensus that this needs to be looked at. I shared with a few people, I found this interesting this week, that Massachusetts, of all states, has a 2.5% increase, allowable increase. And they always have, measures out for overrides by the voters, which usually a lot of times pass. But then it noted that the average property tax in Massachusetts is up to about $7,200 with people leaving the eastern side of the state. And so what that is doing, of course, is similar to what happening with our school levies. They just aren't passing anymore. So I think that maybe the number isn't so important as some built-in degree of flexibility, and maybe that going over 2 years period of time makes a lot of sense, but just to not box ourselves in moving forward.
Okay, a lot of details to be worked out, but I think the concept is there. Okay, folks agree, we'll put that in the report. Senator Hertz.
Thank you. The next item up is one we've discussed here previously, is review and coordinate property tax assistance programs. So basically recommending to the legislature to review all existing property tax assistance programs, evaluate their use by taxpayers, see if we can educate some taxpayers that, hey, these programs are out there available, and then look at qualifications for the programs, including looking at and considering an asset-based test also in addition to income-based. And that's the gist of it. Mr. Chair.
Any thoughts, comments?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I would just, the only comment that Property Assessment Division has on this is going to be a big lift. And of course, going back to the phrase, the devil's going to be in the details. And so we're not, we need to clarify that asset-based test, what it is that you're looking at. Are we wanting people to apply every year? Do they need to provide us with, some of their bank records? What is it that we're looking at there? We currently have about 40,000 applications between the property tax assistance and the disabled veterans. And so it would be labor intensive and require additional FTEs, of course. Unfortunately, until we work out more details, I wouldn't have a firm figure on that, but I just know that would be labor intensive.
Well, and that's correct. And that was just a suggestion put out there. And would it really touch that many taxpayers who are using these property tax assistance programs? And it may not, and it may be too much work to consider maybe the 10 or 50 taxpayers that might be affected by it, who might, using something like that. But you could potentially have, $1 million or more in a 401k plan, and you're 60 years old, and it's just sitting there, and your income is only your Social Security, and your house is paid for, and you get property tax assistance programs, which, that's not what it's designed for, not that particular person. And so I think that was some of the thoughts there. But how many of those are there? We just don't know.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, and I guess too, DOR's in the room. So if there are, I know we've talked through several of these. So if there's certainly some issues with the implementation, and I know we don't have a lot of detail, I get that, but if there's some concerns, please pipe in and let us know. So, and I don't know if you guys have prepared anything on these or not. I know, Scott, you talked about it at one point, but.
And we've met about it.
Okay.
There's just a couple.
Okay.
Just highlight.
Okay. And maybe we can do that kind of after the recommendations. You guys want to fill us in a little bit of what you're thinking on implementation side. So, okay. Any other thoughts on this? Representative Fern. There, Dave. Put your hand up.
Thank you. Any talk about renters and some of the impact on them? I guess in respect to the elderly homeowners and which does cover renters.
We didn't really discuss that too much in detail at the our subcommittee. That was brought up, but I think that's just something for the legislature to continue to look at and consider changes to qualifications, particularly the elderly credit, and whether they want to change some definitions of that and allow more taxpayers.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, mine was similar to what Representative Fern had to add about the renters and seniors, but also just looking at, and obviously this is something I think we need to consider is, is there an income threshold that we want to put in place for people with moderate incomes as the tax rates go up. So that was just in addition to what he had. I just wanted to add that in there as another place to be looking at.
Well, I think too, as we progress with possible homestead exemption, and we discussed this a little bit before, how do these existing programs lay on top of that too? So I think there's just a lot of moving parts here that could potentially be making some changes to, that we really need to focus in on some of these existing programs.
Okay. I will go ahead and add this one then, unless there's any other comments.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the next item is voted mill levy elections should be restricted to dollar amounts rather than mill amounts. That is already allowed in code. It's an either or. You pass a levy based on a dollar or mills. What we're suggesting is here, modify that section of the code and only allow it to be passed on for dollar amounts. Those dollar amounts then could be subject to 1510 420 or 511, whatever it might be, and let those grow with inflation too. So that kind of gets at the windfalls that somebody might make if they just have 15 mills hanging out there and appraisals go up and they fail to drop the mills down to reduce the revenue they're collecting.
Pretty simple. Any comments, thoughts? Okay, if not, we'll go ahead and add that one as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then probably the easiest one here, we got 2 minutes to discuss it, is require new voter approved levies to receive a 60% affirmative vote to be passed. Obviously, there's quite a bit of discussion on that. The dissenting opinions are mill levy elections are already a challenge to pass. So if you're going to raise the threshold up to 60% of those voting, you'll even make it more difficult. And I know the Education Subcommittee has a recommendation also that has to do with voter turnout and voter approval.
Yeah, and that one does have a 60% passage requirement in a particular corridor of turnout, and an invalidation below, I think it's 30%. 30 to 40 is 60% passage. Over 40% is simple majority, and we're using existing law on the bond issues, so you escape the turnout. I'm sorry, the supermajority requirements when you go with either a levy that is on the primary or general, or that's done by mail ballot.
Senator Morrison.
Yeah, I can guess why this one had a little more conversation around it, but for me, kind of similar to like the time frame or the bond levies, the time frame limitations. To me, it just feels like we're kind of adding a little bit of more red tape for local governments, and I feel like we've been trying to reduce red tape. So for me, just having a hard time with this one and the time limits on the 10 years from the bond levy one we talked about earlier.
Mr. Chairman, I'm actually okay with the increased turnout percentage. We may need to borrow some language from the school one. Maybe the 60% is necessary in low turnout elections, right? If somehow only 40% of the voters show up or some small percentage show up, you need a large percentage turnout. But if you have a big turnout election, if you had it on a general and there was 70% voter turnout, I probably would be okay with 51% there. So maybe we need to, but we could tweak this. I like the concept, but maybe get a bunch of discussion on the schools of the steps depending 60% in a low turnout election, 51% in a high turnout election. The goal is to have a bunch of taxpayers informed. You have to have a bunch of the low turnout informed, or consent in with it, or if a ton of people turn out, then maybe a simple majority is fine. So maybe there's a way to balance both concerns. But I do think that if we don't focus on taxpayer transparency, more people being informed of what they're voting on, then we get these outcomes of folks saying, why in the heck did my taxes go up? Well, you voted for it. No, I didn't.
Could you do it as a percentage of those vote? You had to exceed a threshold of the percentage of the registered voters for that election, 30%, 25%, whatever would force the turnout number to be high enough.
Yeah, you could, the lower the turnout percentage, the higher the required passage percentage, the higher the turnout, the lower the something.
If it had to be 30% of the voter, of the registered voters, then if you had a 50% turnout, that'd be 60%. If it was lower than that, you'd have to have almost everybody.
Yeah.
And I think, Lance, that code kind of mentions that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I remember reading this a while ago.
Yeah, our recommendation on the subcommittee just pulled the language from existing code as it applies to bond issues right now, and just suggest imposing that across the board on other levy elections.
And you were at 60% below 40%.
You have to have 30% to validate the election. Turnout of more than 30, but less than 40 is a 60% passage requirement, and over 40 is a simple majority. And other simple majorities are if you run it by mail ballot, which generally almost says the same thing, because mail ballots generally get the turnout you want to get to that, or run it in conjunction with a primary or general.
And that concept, the only thing I don't like about our existing law is the exceptions, the mail and the primary and general elections. If you just strip that out, run it whenever you want, and then you have to meet these thresholds. So then that gets up to a little bit more voter participation. I struggled with looking at that, and I also brought a bill like that last session that applied to everybody, and it was difficult to get through a committee. And then I started thinking about, I don't want to make this all that complicated when we got to start figuring out how many people turned out, what voter approval do you have to have. And then I started looking around the country. There are about 17 states that have supermajority turnouts. And if you think about it, we've always get beat up in the legislature about local control, fine. This is the best part of local control. It's up to the taxpayers to decide what they want their taxes to be like. And when California passed Prop 13 eons ago, they automatically increased all voter levies to 65%. Didn't change a lot down there, but then they started backfilling stuff with sales tax and all other kinds of things. So there are a lot of states that it seems to work. I think a higher supermajority works. I think that incentivizes a local government, a school, or whoever is to be very realistic about what their wants are, and don't reach for the sky, because we've seen that before. Here we want 50 million. Oh, that didn't work. We're gonna come down to 40, and then we finally get a 35, and we found the sweet spot. So get out there, talk to your taxpayers, really what they can afford to do. But I think, whether it's this one or what the Education Subcommittee, I think there's some support out there for giving taxpayers a little bit more control of exactly what's going to happen on their tax bill.
probably just as good as I mention it now as later, but I think one of the problems that schools face in their general fund levy is that the legislature adjourns thinking that they have passed inflation on school district budgets, and you have not. You've passed inflation on 80% of their budgets. And so if you are like the average school district right now, 64% at 97% or above, and let's just say that they're at the max, because that helps me with my calculator in my head, that you get a 3%, you just got 2.4%. And you have to go ping the voter and say, can I please have the completion of what the legislature said they already passed in February and that the governor signed in the first week of March, and we all celebrated that accomplishment. I think that's a major part of the problem that creates a difficulty for us, because in many cases, those levies are, may we please fight for our lives. Can we have the rest of what the legislature already decided as a matter of public policy that should be passed by the legislature? And districts that are above that base budget don't see that. And I understated the percentage of kids at the base, but there are 8,000 kids. So there's basically Helena Public Schools statewide operating at the base across 70 districts or so, maybe less than that. There are 65% living above or at max. And so, if we tackled that issue and you allowed districts to complete the inflation as a matter of policy that was already adopted by the legislature, recognizing that their general fund budget is their general fund budget, that's what you have to constitutionally defend, then honestly, I wouldn't have as much concern about this or the other one. And I think I can live with the other one because it's commonly understood. I think that school districts have figured out how to encourage voter turnout, which I think is the primary objective. Get as many people as possible to the polls so that we can have a true, litmus test of what this community thinks. I don't think there's any of my members that would ever want to see low voter turnout. They just get a little antsy about high passage rates.
So, well, I'm glad that we have discussed our first of three recommendations here. I guess I would weigh in the following way. I'm probably more inclined to have the threshold that are currently in place. There's something about a tyranny of the minority here that I think we should be worried about, as well as the tyranny of the majority, if you will. And so that's what gives me pause. But we certainly need to have high enough turnout that we have a meaningful number of folks. One thing that is absent in current law is that these thresholds for bond elections do not apply to municipalities, only to counties and schools. And there was a time that it did apply to municipalities, but that was stripped from the law. And I did not take the time to figure out what the dynamics were, but I guess what they were that led there. And I think that I think going forward, we should certainly take Senator Hertz's subcommittee's recommendation into consideration. But I think that applying current bond law across the board to all local governments and municipalities should be considered as well. Lance has made a couple of impassioned pleas arguments here about the level of funding of our general funds in the schools, and really what he's arguing, his problem would go away if we rethought what the base level of education is, which I believe, my friend, is making that case every chance he can get. So that, and I think that that's absolutely legitimate. We shouldn't, from a school funding standpoint, our constitutional obligation, we shouldn't have to get to a meaningful base level of funding. It should not require voted levies. It should be the consequence of the formula. That's sort of outside of our scope. But I think beyond that, if that problem, and I believe it exists, it can be corrected, and I believe there's a good chance that it will be. Well, then I think schools ought to be subject to the same kind of limitations as every other entity law.
Shane, I see you still have your hand up. Do you have a comment?
Director. I mean, I think this is really healthy discussion. I think it's good to have a discussion about like how that looks and how that's formulated for for these sorts of levies to get passed. In my mind, it kind of starts to bring up other things, like should there be 60% affirmative vote to elect us into office from, I think, where do you kind of start drawing the line here with it? But, I definitely get the discussion and the points that everybody are making. I think more robust discussion will be had around it, but that's kind of my perspective is I think we start to kind of add these layers of, and I don't mean to say red tape to be harsh, but I feel like it starts to kind of morph into that. And that's where I kind of get a little uneasy. I obviously, Representative Bedey's argument on the base, I think obviously is something that we need to take up and have more conversation about, because I think that really is an underlying problem for a lot of the school funding. But that for me is kind of the perspective I'm coming at, is I just feel like that setting these thresholds starts to make you wonder, well, should we have this threshold for everything, for every single one of us that are elected sitting in the room? I don't know. Maybe I don't know. But I think we start to kind of, I think educating voters is obviously important. We want people to know what they're voting on. We want people to understand the impacts of, what bonds and levies really mean to their tax rates. I think we've failed at that, because I think a lot of times things get passed and it trickles not just down to, the homeowners, but renters and other people who sometimes support these things that aren't thinking through those impacts on how that might impact them too. So I feel like education on this front is critical, and I think we need to continue to explore more ways to have more full-fledged educational efforts on some of these bonds and levies, so that people kind of understand those impacts more. I just don't know if like instituting thresholds is the answer for me, but I think you all know me. I'm always somebody who likes to have discussions around all of these issues to find ways that work for everybody. So I'm glad to have more talks on this later on.
And two comments, Mr. Chairman. One is on the thresholds. Again, remembering my time as an alderman, there was timeframes proactively sought to send out bond levies when folks were gone down south, right? And so anyone that thinks there's not a management to low voter turnout, or to the folks that might be in opposition aren't around to vote, then hasn't been around this game very long. There's always a management to that. Just like when you want large voter turnout, you try to use a mail controlled election. So I'm okay trying to inform more people and not create systems that avoid people voting. Because ultimately, if you want folks happy with your schools, your city, and your county, the more folks that know what's going on, the less likely you're going to have a short-term victory followed by a long-term period of, well, a beating when they find out what they have to pay. The second one is, and this links back to one of Hertz's earlier ones. So if you remember what he mentioned on the fixed mill levies, and he talked about the fact that potentially a 511 or a 15-10-140 structure, the inflation that's subsequent to that would need to be added, because otherwise over a 10-year period, the fixed mill levies would have decreasing value. You have to have inflation set at something. The challenge schools have is above the 80% line, they're fixed, right? So when we give them their inflation input here, and we've decided inflation is 3% or 2.5 or whatever number we arrive at, that subsequent number above that is not able to float. And so as we talk about doing that for cities and counties in 511, we may need to consider doing that as well, because otherwise, if you're ratting at 100%, with 3%, you're truly getting a 2.4, and it does impact their general fund. It was an interesting formulaic design, but if we do say, takes money to put tires in the snowplow or to do whatever those are doing, we may need to consider that if our fixed mills are going to float for cities and counties, they may indeed need to float in that portion of the formula, which would then ensure that as the state picked up its 67%, the locals were involved as well. Obviously, the 95 mil would have some bigger backfills, but anyway, just a thought process, 2 comments.
So, Mr. Chairman, I serve on 2 other task force, and we've had competing recommendations from subcommittees. And as you write your report, what we'll do is, in those instances, we've kind of folded similar recommendations together, and I think this could be very easily on this one. I mean, just tweaking the education subcommittee language a little bit, and talks about applying voter turnout and or supermajority requirements to mill levy elections. And the legislature should consider looking at existing statutory language that we have already in for bonding language and applying that to all types of levy elections in all local governments. So something similar, merging these two together. And, obviously the legislature is going to, consider what they want to do here and what the final product's going to look like.
Certainly, and I think the principle behind this is simply trying to get more voter turnout. That's ultimately where you're heading here.
Right.
I think that's great. I think everybody's on board with that. And the question becomes, how do we get that done? But that's probably going to, it's more than just the levies. So,
And Mr. Chairman, while it's always purchased, brought up, people, some areas of the state may have not had that turnout to elect someone. Electing someone doesn't suddenly change their taxes for the next, well, it might, depending who they elect, but it doesn't at least immediately change their taxes for a subsequent period of time and show up in their mailbox.
that's true. Okay, as a consensus, we'll go ahead and put that in the report. And to Senator Hertz's point, it very well might get combined with the education recommendation as well.
Mr. Chairman, I am done. Thank you for your time. Sorry I went over 15 minutes.
All right, we will move on to the education subcommittee. Representative Bedey.
Yes.
I think we've kind of we've already talked about it.
Right, I think we can pass on the first recommendation. And we'll move on to state school levy. The state school levy, otherwise known as the 95 mil levy, obviously was a bone of contention here across the state and continues to be, at least in some locales. What the subcommittee has recommended here, although I believe there are some dissenting opinions, maybe dissenting opinions on this, we had a few people missing, is that we resolve this issue with state levy by fixing it at 95 mils, which is effectively the rate that it's been since its inception, and recognize the fact that current equalization law, as amended by House Bill 587, does provide some pretty significant tax relief as well. For example, in 2025, we're looking at a $53 million reduction in local taxes between the base general fund levy and retirement levy. In terms of implementation of this, follow-on recommendation would be, if indeed we were to adopt this sort of thing, it seems to me to be pointless to have the state school levy appear in 1510-420 or the House Bill 511 version of that. I think it causes more confusion than it helps. We did, by the way, I have nothing to report that wasn't reported at our last meeting. This is just a recap, a brief form of what was reported on when we met in May. We did examine taking the 95 mil levy down to say 79 in fiscal year 79 mils and fiscal year 26, and then floating it thereafter. And number one, so long as current law remains in effect, you're not going to see a substantial decrease in local property, or you actually in local property taxes, because of the way our equalization laws work now with 587. Some of that would be shifted to the local taxpayers already. But even if you were to change, even if you were to substantially change equalization law so that full reduction of the 95 mils down to 79 and then floating thereafter it came into effect, so that the burden was felt strictly by the state general fund, it would be a pretty heavy hit on the state general fund. And of course, the state general fund has the effect, is an effect on income taxpayers. But look at tax policy in a comprehensive way, maintaining conservative approach, I suppose, is maintaining the status quo more or less with respect to school funding, so that we are providing not putting pressure on income taxpayers. At the same time, in terms of overall tax policy, by not putting pressure on income taxpayers makes room for further efforts that have been ongoing for the last couple of sessions to reduce income tax rates as well. So that's the pitch on that.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just add it, we strongly support this idea. And specifically, if you look back when these levies were increased, and they did not originate in 1993, but they were, the 40 was created in 1993. And there was an increase in the county elementary and high school levies. And that was in direct satisfaction of an equity lawsuit that had a court saying that the state was forcing an excess reliance on local variable levies. And so the solution at that time was a static, consistent, uniform 95 mills to basically act as a brake against the distribution out on a place like Hart Butte that has $78 for its mill, and El Zeta that has $2,700. Or look at $453,000 for a mill in Bozeman, and look at a comparable community of similar size that's half that, and another one of the largest 7. So I think it's prudent to continue to ensure the consistency of that 95 mills, and part of that is the $49 on a median price home that it buys you if you put a dent in it. So at a macro level, it's 80 million gone that has to be found in the general fund, or found from dialing back the GTB ratio back to where it was in 2017 before the state spent $100 million to displace local taxes. Those are kind of your figures. And at a macro level, that's huge. But at a micro level, it's $100 if you're in a more than average county. It's 49 on a statewide basis. And even if you're in one of the high wealth communities, it's short of $200. And nobody's going to feel great about either paying that $200 or losing that $200. The fact is, they're not going to know the difference. And so in terms of what it buys you through consistency is it gives you a real, first of all, it keeps you sustained at the aggressive level of tax relief that this legislature has already implemented from 2017 until now, between the combination of the dial-up on the ratio in 2017, and then the sort of temporary hitch a ride on marijuana revenue under Representative Lear's bill for a couple of years, and now House Bill 587. You've done some remarkable work in displacing local property taxes that would be easily get this from any of your staff $110 million higher if it were not for those fairly significant efforts. And so in the spirit of not going back to a court that someday says, yeah, we told you to quit excessively relying on that, and we never gave you permission to start floating this thing 10 years after we barely let you out of constitutional conflicts here in 1993. The fact is that we've never, even while the Department of Revenue has conducted that floating analysis, we've never reached the point from 1993 until now where we decided to put it down. Let's not. That's a pretty strong track record of good efforts by the state of Montana to ensure equity and adequacy. And I think you'll rue the day if we allow it to be selectively reduced in that way. And, you always have at your disposal the ability to change tax rates in a way that can bring in less or more revenue from those 95 mills. And it's better to do it globally than to do it in a very specific way that takes away from the very remedy that you successfully implemented in response to the court's decision in Helena Elementary back in 1993.
Mr. Chairman, I would weigh in here as well as the author of 587. So first off, everyone knows my stance on the 95 mills. I've been pretty straightforward about that from the beginning. But let's talk about it from a different part of it. We're a state without a sales tax. We're not going to have a sales tax. That's just the way it is, right? We're also a state that has significant move-in. Whether you're in Eureka and you've seen the Canadian movement, whether you're in Whitefish and you've got Iron Horse And that's a different, whether you're down in Big Sky and Yellowstone Club, and I can go around the state and I can list these. But we're seeing a significant vacation home move-in. Right, and more power to it. There's nothing at all wrong with that. It certainly drives construction. It's a great positive for most of Montana. But what I do notice is that in this area that moves in, a significant portion of these folks are not paying income tax in the state of Montana. The previous chairman of Microsoft, so I don't say names online, well-known singers, a well-known football player, all hold very nice houses here. They benefit from our educated workforce. So the general fund puts 93% of his dollars to 3 areas: incarceration, medication, and education. And the vast majority of that, if you look at just $8, is education. So I'm guessing they benefit if they have a heart attack when they're here from having a doctor look at them, have an engineer design their roads, their houses, their work. They benefit from a well-educated workforce, from having RNs, from having those items. They certainly benefit, since most of them live in a WUI and an urban interface, from the $180 million worth of general fund that goes into the fire fund. They certainly benefit from not having serial killers on the street, from having public safety response. They benefit from all of these areas, and that's fine. They do benefit from it. Now, one of the things they do pay back to the schools is they ultimately probably do not have a lot of children in the state. A lot of them don't live here. Their kids don't go to school here. So they do pay into this 95 mil fund, which collects large portions of money. And what that fund does, it picks up that money, and now it's very clearly identified in a separate state special revenue account. You can see it, right? And currently, 55 cents of every dollar buys down local property taxes. That percentage could change up and down if need be, but 55 cents on every dollar, now somewhere around north of 300 million, buys down local property taxes. And it does so by harvesting what has become like our new silver mine. We are very Hawaii-like in the western 60% of Montana. We see some significant dollars from folks. And in truth, there's a lot of industries that do not headquarter here. I don't think Burlington Northern's headquartered here unless I missed it, or some of the others. So it does harvest a lot of dollars, and it returns them to those communities where the kids are. And so, yeah, we could drop that. We could try to pick up the differential from the Montana income tax, which, by the way, wasn't paid by the previous chairman of Microsoft, but is paid by the guy living in the school district. So we could take money from his one pocket, stick it in his other, keep income tax rates a little higher, defeat the equalization formula, probably likely end up in court. It doesn't make much sense. So no, I have been an advocate of this for a long time. It's not that I don't like paying lower taxes, and I recognize some of the large industrials and the pipelines, and then would prefer this. It's some areas. In particular in eastern Montana, it's really the only taxes they pay. So I get that if that's what you cut, that's what you cut. But in the end, those areas where the kids aren't, often at folks, at regions that aren't paying property tax, often those folks that benefit from, that aren't paying income tax, that benefit from the income tax are participating in this. And they're doing it in a manner that benefits Montana education. The 95 mils works, and that's why I've supported it being fixed. That's why I don't support it dropping. It's why I continue to say it's the right thing to do, not only because I'm supportive of our schools, but unless someone else, and we'll talk about this in my section as well, but unless someone else tells me how it is in a state without a sales tax, we have those folks participate, I don't see how. And to suggest that, well, they do force a lot of construction. Well, the construction workers do pay income tax when they're working here. And they probably likely pay property tax and have kids in the school. So you're right, it is helping the construction workers too. I think this is the right thing to do. I've been open about it from the beginning. I remain thinking it.
I was just going to say, of course, always with all of these, the devils will be in the detail. And as we know, at SB 587, which you just explained, and I've heard it explained many times, we also have removal of possible removal of 15, 10, 420 or implementation of SB 511. So I think it's just the devil's in the details. Look at all of these and how things are all going to move around and shift and all of that. So just a comment.
Senator Borjo.
Thank you, Director. Yeah, I think you've heard a lot of good input from people. I'm fortunate to be on a committee with some of the premier experts in Montana on this topic. So I feel like sometimes I'm sort of spoiled in that regard. But I agree. I think, in my opinion, our schools obviously need more resources. They're always going to need more resources, especially as inflation comes on. And I think there's a lot of things we need to be doing for our school systems. But I think this was pretty well thought out. I think the recommendation and the rationale just made a lot of sense to me. And I really appreciate the committee's efforts in looking into this and the chair's explanations and being always so concise and clear. So I obviously support this from our committee.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the Revenue Committee has drafted bills. Basically, the department will probably like this. It's taking out the language in the 95 mil sections, and it just says the department shall calculate on a statewide basis the number of mills to be imposed. That language would be stricken. So the 95 mills would be intact, and it would be probably as a good idea, it would take the legislature some positive actions to change those 95 mills and not leave it on the laps of the department to come in and make changes where it probably really doesn't belong anyway. We have not acted on those drafts yet. So.
Like it sounds like to me we have a consensus on that recommendation. So got it. Thank you. President Bedey.
I'll move on then to the last recommendation. Previous recommendation clearly had tax shift implications associated with it. That would be the removal of the 95 mills. Now we move to a proposal to replace the current mandatory formula-driven district-based general fund levies with a countywide levy. That would be an aggregation of across school districts within a county. And this is a mechanism that has been used, is currently used funding as pertains to retirement levies, which are done on a countywide basis as well. Now, interestingly, a lot of great modeling was done on this. Mr. Melton actually participated as well as our staff. And our initial indications are that 69% of school districts across the state would see a reduction in mills levied, and that would account for about 83% of Montana students, just because they're not uniformly distributed across districts. And if you're looking at a reduction for 83% of Montana students, probably to about 83% of Montana's, just roughing it out. Clearly, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and so there would be tax shifts going on between school districts within within counties, but the net effect would be positive here, as was indicated by the numbers I just gave you. As pointed out by my colleague across the table, the devil's in the details, and school funding formula itself is rather complex. And in addition to making changes to relevant school funding laws, we'd also have to take a look at tuition laws as well, particularly as pertains to out-of-district attendance, both within a county or across county lines. And the tuition lines laws also apply to funding of special needs students, and those are some considerations we'd have to take into account as well. But I think that this is, despite all of the complexity of this, it certainly is doable.
Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
Just a couple of additional facts there on the amount. There's a legitimate question. So, okay, you achieve this equity. Who gets hurt and who gets hurt heavily? And so out of 397 school districts, there's 359 who have a swing of less than 10 mils one direction or the other. So by virtue of improving, your current disparity is all the way from 0 mils to 51 mils. When you spend $250 million in GTB, you still have a variation in mils of between 0 and 51. This narrows it down to 36 to 41 with 4 outliers. And we handed out a scattergram last time. Those outliers are Fallon at about 31. You almost want to include them, but you don't want to have to say 30 to 40 to 1 just to get one county. So that's an outlier. Webo, Madison, and Carter. And they are left relatively unscathed compared to if you went for my original idea, which I'm glad we discarded, which is just a uniform imposition of another 36 mils statewide. It really did wall up those outliers. And so these outliers are there. But in terms of all the rest of the counties, you're just hovering right in there in a very narrow range. So you actually get a much more constitutionally defensible expenditure of GTB. And make no mistake about it, the combination of GTB and local mills together will be considered the state's share for which you're responsible for an equitable distribution. So this substantially enhances the defensibility of that portion of your general fund budget. To get a little in the weeds here, it's 35.3% of the 100% max that is interdependent between local mills and GTB, and you achieve for the same amount of expenditure. We actually went on your FY25 estimated GTB, got that from Paul, and I'm sure Paul and Nancy put that together. And we were able to show that for the exact same state expenditure of GTB, you yield a much more defensible disparity in mills among all the counties here.
Yes, unfortunately, we didn't provide the slide so you can see how much this contracts this and drives the shot. Well, not the way slide look. The shot group is a lot smaller now, and it does achieve a tax equity objective.
And effectively, what you're doing is keeping that money local. You're looking at your neighbors. So within this county, how much does it take to ensure that the kids in this county have a constitutionally defensible set of schools? And so the sharing there is not between Madison County, or rather Ennis School District and the rest of the state, but between Ennis and Harrison and Twin Bridges and Sheridan, keeping it local. And I think that's the substantial additional benefit of going this route as opposed to the full uniform imposition. And even those the ones who have the largest increase when you're done tend to be those places that are heavily populated by second homes and high wealth homes that we discussed earlier here. And even when they go up, they don't go up as high as everybody else. So it's still in that realm of reasonableness. The biggest one that I could give you would be that in Gallatin County, everybody has about 39 mills after this is done, and some of them right now have almost none. And like I say, with regard to Madison, that's just a very small piece of the portion of the territory that has no kids in it, but that creates a tax base for a single district that would now be shared among all the districts in Madison County. So those are your outliers, and Webo and Carter and Fallon are energy dependent counties that you would expect to be outliers as well.
Mr. Chairman, take it out of the non-technical. Basically, you're equalizing twice, right? So the GTB dollars goes farther. You equalize across the county, which takes care of those kids within the county. It begins to break down some of the challenges we've had with administrative overhead. Some counties, some of our 397, we had some of the largest number of school districts in Montana, certainly more than all of our surrounding states. I think Wyoming might have 50 some. But it begins to break down some of the challenges of these little arbitrary lines in the sand within the counties have. It helps us with some concepts of administrative overhead. It makes it easier for the students to move around. It still guards the fact that if somebody votes above the 80% line, votes a Taj Mahal type building, that's still on them. But below the 80% line, that permissives, it equalizes that within the county. And what occurs then, because it's equalized once, the GTB formula then would come in on a county basis. So you get a double smoothing, which is causing what Lance says, while helping with administrative overhead, while making sure that there's a chance that these lines are existing for a reason. It does smooth the system a lot. There's just no question about it. And it's pretty easy to argue you're taking care of that student within your county. Unless a certain area of the county voted, in which case they're in their own district.
Any further comments?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I think it's a good idea. You guys think in the long run this might help certain school districts to consider merging with other school districts within that county?
Here's what I like to say, because I'm a strong advocate of local control, and of course I have every school district in the state as our member. And I like to say, give them a chance to prove that they are there on the basis of education. And you don't have to force consolidate, but if there are any out there that are existing in order to preserve a tax advantage for a set of, landowners in that area, they're going to go away because there's no longer going to be any point to it. So this will substantially remove the unusual incentive to continue to exist for reasons other than the kids. But past that, let the chips fall where they may, and let the districts decide whether or not they want to put together a great little one-room schoolhouse and know that they're paying the same taxes as if they went right down the road. I like to think in our neck of the woods, yours, but some of mine too, because we have a small cabin up there, but it's Upper West Shore. If you're in Upper West Shore Elementary, let them decide whether they want to continue to have Upper West Shore in Dayton over on Flathead, or whether they want to become part of Polson, and don't create a significant disparity in the tax load associated with having a constitutional adopted general fund budget to interfere in that.
Comments? No, we'll go ahead and add this one to the recommendation as well. Ron, you, Representative Jones.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I only have one simple recommendation. It's unlikely to create any controversy at all, because that's how we always do things. So again, we boiled it down to our primary recommendation, which was looking at both a homestead and a comstead exemption. For the reasons I articulated earlier, is we tried to do this in a manner that ensured those folks that benefit from the income tax side of the equation would not exist in the owner dwelling column, but they would participate potentially higher on the property tax side because they wouldn't qualify for a homestead exemption. And so effectively, and again, the amounts, I got to begin by saying that obviously we had to set these at some level in this document to hold this conversation for where things currently are pre the new reappraisals coming out, which hopefully the department will have as soon as possible, because these will have to be retweaked to match that system. What we basically targeted was trying to come up with a 15 to 20% permanent property tax reduction for owner dwellings. The owner dwelling would match currently what, if you qualified for the rebate, 7 months in your home, etc., you would qualify for the owner dwelling, and learn long-term rentals, which is going to take more work on the department's behalf. But however, my argument's going to be on the rebate side is we begin there. That if you qualify for the rebate, you automatically qualify for this homestead exemption. Beyond that, it's going to move up. Owner dwellings, we're going to long-term rentals will have to look at a little deeper, that the burden would be shifted then to non-owner dwellings, which it was brought up by the department that 21% of the taxable value in Montana was being mailed to an out-of-state address, and also by the short-term rentals. Now, I'm not trying in any way to be punitive to a short-term rental, but truthfully, they very much act like a hotel, which is in a commercial rate of 189. And so if you're a permanent short-term rental, then you would then move to this. You would not receive this discount. So basically, the residential tax rate would shift to 1.9% unless you qualified for the homestead exemption or the long-term rental, in which case you'd be 1.1%. That discrepancy seems to zero out. Now we have to pair it with a Comstead exemption, and that work, it has a cap in there of 4 times the median value house. This occurs up to about 4 times $350,000, right? And again, that reasonably well aligns with what happens today, because as you're aware, the residential rate increases at 1.5 million today. So it's not going to be punitive to owner dwellings in the state of Montana that are substantially higher value. You have to partner with a Comstead exemption, and the Comstead exemption is a 2-tiered process where you get a lower rate, and we've currently set it in here at 1.5% for up to the first 6 times the median value, because that's the majority of the chart in so the first $3 million ish of commercial property, you would get a lower rate, and after that you would go to 2.1%. The reason they need to move together is if you go to places like eastern Montana where there wasn't residential increases, market value increases, and you were to run this program with only one side of it, you would see a substantial transfer to commercial. But the combination of the two, remarkably, in an interesting way, balances statewide pretty well across the state of Montana in being reasonably revenue neutral. Now, this is somewhat akin to what we've done many times in the past when we went in and we took the rate of residential and we just dropped the rate. The difference being, if you just drop the rate, I believe a proposal was once 135 to 0.94. What occurs then is you immediately have a transference, right? Because you're not charging that to anyone. You're simply saying all the other property classes pay for it. And given that residential has become 75% of the book of business, there's not enough room for that kind of transfer statewide. So this is a unique approach to a homestead and Comstead exemption. There are some out there that suggest we transfer it to the income tax. And I could go through my big spiel about who doesn't pay income tax in Montana and why would I want to transfer it to the person that lives in the school district already. Without a doubt, there's going to be some mill shifting around the state. It's not possible to get 56 counties perfect. But this appears, at least on the surface, at these numbers to deal with this challenge. Again, we need to be clear, and one of our folks on our committee, who I'm soon will speak up here as well, had pointed out we need to be clear to know that it is transferring, right? It's going to, those guys that are now paying 1.9 are going to be paying more, right? The short-term rentals are going to be paying more. Those folks that aren't paying income tax are going to be paying more. There are some folks in the state of Montana that own second homes that are potentially going to pay more, but now they will be able to pay less on their first home. There are some books of business that will have to change behavior. A lot of farms, for instance, hold their homes in LLCs. Now, I'm likely, they're not renting them out, but I'm likely guessing that given that they're renting them to themselves, they'll probably write themselves long-term rental agreements, and you'll see some behavior shifts in that manner. But ultimately, if our goal is in a state without a sales tax, to try to include what the new quote-unquote silver mine appears to be, which is a number of folks building vacation homes, kudos to them, but not paying income tax here, that this would help them participate a higher level while giving our owner dwellings and long-term rentals, those we were targeting, a 15 to 20% decrease. Now, obviously, this needs to be partnered with some of the capping and the other items, but at least at the level it works, it seems to work at this level. Again, we'll need to look at the new appraisals when they come out, and there'll be other thought processes that occur. Some of the discomfort level was, we currently show 215,000. I believe that was the number of folks that qualified for the rebate. I'm guessing that will go up some this time. So that's potentially a larger number that would benefit, because more folks might apply. And you might have folks choosing not to apply because it's not worth it in their mind to do it for once or twice. You might have others that decide, wow, if this is a long-term deal, we'll have some additional applications there. It is somewhat difficult to know, and a process would have to be created. And obviously, we wouldn't want it so complex it derailed the system, but how do you determine what's a long-term rental or not? Now, currently, we're trying to align with what's in the law. Obviously, we talked about the rebate, the 7 months, don't change anything there. Then we already have a population. On the differential between short and long-term, the bed tax currently uses 1 month. So it would seem to me that would be what we want to stick with. We want to say that because currently we are at least collecting, or to those reporting, we're collecting bed tax from those folks that are learning out as a short-term rental less than 1 month. So I would argue that if you are renting your property out, you don't live in it more than 7 months, and you're renting it out for timeframes less than 1 month, you would probably fall into the short-term rental category. And again, there's always going to be, the devil will be in the details of how you get this to work and how you determine what is a long-term rental, how you actually count them. But at this point, this thing will move somewhere between, if you get both sides working on it, it'll move $175 million around. It's the only thing that moves a substantial amount of money around to make a dent in a $2.1 billion property tax system that's meaningful. And so, Mr. Chairman, that is the work we produced.
Okay. There's a couple of comments online here. We'll start with Cindy. There's Cindy.
Yep, I'm here. Sorry, I just can't. I had to push the right button. So I had a couple of questions. The first is, and obviously, because Lou and I have talked about this significantly, and I did comment online when they sent the documents out. But what about those farms and ranches that the individuals do own their own home, but they also have several other homes that their kids use, and they're all part of the farming operation, but they're owned by one person or one entity? Then are you saying that a long-term rental agreement would suffice for them if they had it with their parents, for instance? And then in that regard, even if it weren't their parent, if they were a hired man or something, wouldn't that cause their income to go up? And wouldn't it cause the liability for payroll taxes and workman's comp and unemployment to also increase for the farmers and ranchers? And then the other question I had was in regard to the 21% of the property tax bills going to out-of-state addresses. Does that take into account all of those people like me? When I had a mortgage on my home, my mortgage was sold to a third party and my property tax bill went out of state. Those are my two questions.
So, Mr. Chairman, on the mailing of the property taxes, we had that question come up before, and I believe the department had indicated the mortgage one, it did deal with the mortgage one. If there was a concern about the mail to out of state, I would have it's a person that just gets his taxes in Arizona that truly lives here, right? And because that it just happens to be that time of year. That, however, at least because there's no way to better measure that until we actually do it. That at least seemed reasonably offset by the person that has a vacation home here that has the taxes mailed here to its caretaker, even though they live out of state. So what we saw was a 1% per year increase, fairly steady in the number of taxes of tax value moved mailed to out-of-state addresses, it seemed to be reasonably aligned with the increase in properties you can see with your eyes across the state as the state becomes more and more Hawaii-like in the western 60% in particular. On the LLCs, I would argue that yes, if you wish to qualify for a long-term rental, because you do get some benefit as a person that owns a number of these as well, you do get some benefit for by being in an LLC. It's part of your book of business of being able to expense items that you would have to have a long-term rental agreement. Now, potentially what the rent was or how you set that up, I think would be up to you. The reality would be, is it true, right? If it's actually creating a long-term rental housing for a Montanan, I would assume there'd be a way to qualify. To the extent of how you did that, that would all have to be worked out. And then find three, I have to be clear. There is no system we can create, none, that will not shift taxes somewhere. You're either going to shift them to income tax, which Montanans pay, you're going to shift them to other classes of property, or you're going to find a way to work it within the system. It won't just be farms and ranches. There's lots of businesses that own limited liability companies too. To the extent that this is actually part of their housing, they've chosen to hold the property in this manner, which does mean that when they sell the property, they will end up paying capital gains. They probably won't be able to call it a home owner dwelling. Not that capital gains is that substantial, but it will change what the income is reported as. They're going to have some current tax advantages. Potentially, they're going to have some challenges in paying capital gains in the future with this. If they truly are providing long-term housing for someone, I'm going to guess there's a way to qualify. But the devil's going to be in the details of how you work all of this out. What will occur is if we get too aggressive, because here's the other side of how this is done. You do what we always did in the past. You take the 135, you make it 1-1. You say, let the chips fall where they may. And they will fall on agriculture. They will fall on commercial. They will fall on every other class. It will transfer. This harvest, to the greatest extent possible, those folks with 2 homes, vacation homes, short-term rentals, etc. The devil will again be in the details. There's not an intent to have somebody that's living in a home, on a farm, in a long-term rental, to not qualify.
No, and I think to Cindy's point, there's going to be an option. It sounds like to me, or there certainly should be a path for that to become a long-term rental. And as to the second point of that question, which is, will they have to count for that in terms of income or work comp or UI? I mean, I'll defer to the accountant in the room, but it's my understanding they legally are required to do that now.
Yeah,
so if they're not doing that, that's a different problem.
Right. Okay. Thanks, guys. I just questions answered.
Here.
So you're going to trade off some tax benefits of being able to deduct the house and all the associated things for lower property tax. Okay, the amount you're going to change, you're still being better off to pay the higher property tax and keep all the other deductions that go with it. As a general statement. I mean, each one could be different, but it gives you the option to figure out which one works best for you. You can't fit everybody, and that's one exception out in the law that exists, and it's been a great benefit for ag, but that's where it's at.
Senator Marshall.
Yeah, thank you, Director. Yeah, I think we got to do something like this for, Homestead and Comstead. Just 2 thoughts. I know Representative Jones said, devil's in the details. There's things obviously we'll have to get figured out. But for me, I still think we got to have something in there for seniors. We got to have something in there for renters who see a lot of those impacts passed on to them. Some sort of credit. I don't know what that looks like exactly right now, but I think we need to keep that in mind. I was pretty vocal about that when he started this process. I really wanted to keep renters in mind, especially since my community has so many. I do just want to point out one thing that I think we also should keep our eye on is with the short-term rentals, there are a lot of Montanans who have that as their retirement plan. It's an investment thing. People purchase them. I have a short-term rental, and I pay income taxes in Montana. I pay property taxes on the property. And so I think just having some sort of mechanism in there to account for those people who which there are a lot. There are a lot of people who do have, rental properties that, they rent to people or they, do STRs. And I think what we've seen over the last year is short-term rentals have self-corrected because the market became so saturated. So I would just say keep that in mind, because I think a lot of those folks are income taxpayers and property taxpayers, and I don't really think we want to hammer them too hard when I think we really know that some of those folks who are coming in and buying properties up and renting them and departing to another state and come here once or twice a year or some of the folks who are causing some problems on our tax base. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah, my quick question. I know you guys did a big formula for this. I'm curious how many Montana income tax owners would then, for class 4 properties, not qualify for this exemption. Did you guys look that up? Do we know that? So in our home for 20% of the out-of-state homeowners, there's a risk there that we're doing a massive shift of up to, I think, 35% property tax increase to Montana income taxpayers. Is that correct?
I guess restate that question. So in other words, or maybe Eric, you have the. Okay, why don't you go ahead and restate that question, DJ?
Yeah, the question specifically is how many of the Montana income taxpayers that own class 4 property would not qualify for this exemption?
So my answer to that would be is if they live in the class 4 property as a primary dwelling, they would qualify. If they own a rental home, if they own a vacation home that they're not long-term renting out, they're just on a vacation home. And again, there's all the qualifications, the property underneath, if it's on the lake, can be discounted. But if they own a vacation home, they would only qualify. You can only get this program on one home, right? Correct. A ton of states touch this in this similar manner, right? Where your primary dwelling, this is not intended to be a benefit for vacation homes. This is intended to be an incentive for primary dwellings.
And I think as was pointed out, Representative Jones, a minute ago, if you are in fact doing short-term rentals, you're more of a commercial operation than you are a residential. So the question is, why are we giving you residential benefits? In fact, you are a commercial business competing with commercial industry. I think that question.
Yeah, to follow up and bring more clarity, anecdotally, representing the realtors in the room, I know how many people buy second. I mean, there's a significant amount of Montanans that buy second homes in Montana because they want to enjoy it. And I guess the fear of not knowing that number is, yes, that out-of-stater might be able to afford that lake property with the additional taxes. But now that person from Missoula trying to buy that lake up in or piece of property in Flathead can't do it anymore. So you're actually lending to this problem where Montanans can't afford to actually have a second place in Montana. So that's the basis of the question.
Without a doubt, there's going to be some shift across the board. And if you're pursuing a second home, truthfully, Montana is one of the lowest property. As a person that owns a house in Texas and some other places, Montana property tax rate is not significant. And even at the higher rate in this, you're below the Texas rate. We are fortunate that we are, in particular for a state with no sales tax, a relatively low property tax. Most of the vacation homes, etc., I've seen live in a WUI. They take additional fire. Without a doubt, there's going to be a shift. I began by saying to vacation homes. You only get it on one primary dwelling. Now, we're going to see some creativity. Wife's going to own one home and the husband the other and all that. But assuming the reality of it, you're going to see a shift to vacation homes, in-state or out-of-state homes or second homes. You're going to see a shift to short-term rentals. The message that came out earlier on short-term rentals was moving them to the commercial category. The challenge with that is you're going to get zoned out of half the neighborhoods in the world because commercial property can't exist in residential neighborhoods. But there's a lot of pressure to move them to commercial property anyway. This just takes care of the rate. There is no free ride, right? The other option is shifted to the income tax payer. And at some point, it'll result in increases in income tax.
Well, I think that the point of this committee, if I could bring us all the way back to the beginning, was to consider the residential property tax payer. That was the point. If I can think back to 2023, when we went through session and all of the pains of reappraisal and all of the issues with the tax bills, the hike and all this, I mean, it wasn't vacation homes that were coming in complaint. Primary residences that were saying, I don't know how to pay for this. So that's why we're here, right? We are here to try to fix primary residents, Montana residents, so in their homes. So I understand that this might shift to some extent to some out of state, some second homes, frankly, some business propositions that are now short-term rentals, but those are business propositions. That's not their main home. So I think we're stay focused.
And number wise, we don't know exactly how many long-term rentals there are, but I'm going to guess, given there's 215,000 owner dwellings, probably more like 225 by the time we get it. I'm going to guess more sign up this time. I think we're going to be able to make a statement like 250,000, maybe more, right? Homeowner, owner dwellings and long-term rentals. I'm probably on the low side because I think there's more long-term rentals than that. But 250,000 or more owner dwellings and long-term rentals are going to receive a 15 to 20% property tax reduction. 30,000 or so small businesses are going to receive a 15 to 20% reduction. There's going to be some mill shifting depending on your counties. Nothing's going to be perfect. Some will be higher, some will be lower. But the word I heard on the street wasn't that someone was angry about the taxes they paid on their vacation home. They were unhappy they couldn't live in their dwelling, particularly our elderly and low income. And so I would hope that 250,000 owner dwelling property tax decreases that has to be covered by someone, because I doubt the schools are going to take less. I doubt the cities or counties are going to take less. There is no doubt there will be some shifting that occurs. It absolutely has to happen. I haven't not yet found a more reasonable way to have participation from what is currently a fairly growing population of folks that do not, for the most part, they receive the services provided by income tax. They do not participate in them, and they often have dwellings where the trees are, which takes some of the largest public safety input there is.
EJ, did you have another question or comment, or we'll go on to Rhonda if not?
Yeah, I was just, I guess the question wasn't asked specific enough, and I'll just follow up. So does the department know how many residents own that second home or vacant land currently? Is that a statistic or a number that is easily?
I'm in a no.
Okay.
No, the department tracks the properties really well, but the owners associated with them and the characteristics of those owners are generally much more difficult to get information on. That's why the rebate is so important to this analysis, because that was the way that we were able to identify primary residents. But short of that, it's hard to say anything about the owner necessarily.
No, the additional homes, they didn't ask for the rebate, essentially is what you're saying. Yeah.
You know who qualified for the rebate?
They qualified for the one rebate. They could, have had 4 homes, but we don't know that.
So they could be renting them out.
That's true. Correct. And that's the other thing I would point out. I mean, I think that's the one thing in this proposal that's unique is that, even over last session, and I believe it was Shane that made this comment about renters, but this should help renters, I would hope, in the sense that if we are trying to help long-term rentals, that should also buy down that rental rate as well. And that's, one of the things we've heard multiple times, so.
Thank you.
130,000 renters.
So most of my concerns were actually brought up and have been covered under the section that said dissent. And my dissent is really not dissent, it's just concern. I do hope, I heard Representative Jones ask for those new reappraisal numbers as soon as possible. I do hope we get those soon. Having been through this a couple of times in my career, I know that we could do a lot of planning, and those numbers that we see in January or whenever we happen to see them could end up being very, very different and change our formula a lot. I do have some concern that the number of property tax rebates we sent back and the number of owner-occupied dwellings that the Census Department has is a really large difference. I also have some concerns that anytime you write tax, and I guess it's not a concern, it's just when you write tax law, you drive behavior. When you take away an ability to take something off your taxes or change the way something's taxed, you change the way people behave. So I think you're going to get a lot of these that we're counting right now as increase to help pay for this are going to end up being, there's suddenly going to be a rental agreement written on them. I mean, it just doesn't take much more than a first-year accountant to figure that out. So I'm a little concerned that there's some places that we are will be overpromising, and I don't want us to do that, because if the taxable value ends up going down, then those mills in any one of these taxing jurisdictions, and it could be as small as just a fire district, then the mills float up. So I'm really hoping that we get to see those new numbers early, and I'm hoping that we don't overpromise, because I think there's some counties that this is going to work really well in. Now, that said, in the past, we've lowered the taxable rate to adjust for this. And it did the same thing. We knew there were counties that it really didn't make one bit of difference. There were some counties that it actually raised the taxes, and other counties that it dropped them significantly. That's what happens when you have to do a statewide average. So I think this is probably the best option we have, given that we have to figure out how to fund it with other property taxes. But I do hope that we push revenue to get us those numbers as soon as possible.
Mr. Chairman, one more comment. Go ahead. I misstated here. I meant I needed to say 130,000 renters, so 215,000, which I believe will grow maybe to 225,000 primary dwellings and 130,000 long-term rentals. And so you're talking 350,000 dwellings of some form or another receives an impact under this deal. There will be, as Rhonda indicated, some shifting around. This will do a much better job than just changing the rate, because that drove the shifting immediately. This at least allows a participation by an out-of-state and a short-term force to help buy that down, to the extent that force isn't significant enough. There will be some shifting, and that's just how it is, but it's going to be substantially reduced. And based upon the best calculations we have now, we've kind of zeroed it out on a statewide average. It will need to be combined with, because we're going to monkey with the 95 mills at the state level in some manner. So we're going to need to either adjust 587 or tweak a GTB number to make sure that there's not an undue benefit to the state. The devil will be in the details, but those are not impossible details to calculate.
I got a technical question, I think. I see that you're doing this hybrid rate, a preferential rate for commercial up to a certain value, and then the higher rate above. Are you doing a hard cut for residential, or is it a similar preferential rate and then a higher rate for values above that amount?
Well, so both of them, if you were an owner dwelling, right, you would get the reduced rate on that below. Say you were an owner dwelling worth 10 million, you would pay the lower rate.
There you go. That's all I really was asking, is you get the lower rate up to 4 times the median value, and the higher rate for the reduced value above.
And it's actually, everybody's paying the higher rate, but you qualify because that makes it constitutional for this program. The other one's just a bifurcated rate. You get 1.5 up to 6 times 2.1 thereafter.
Thank you.
But like a $500,000 property, you're talking on second home, you're probably only talking $200-300.
Yeah, it's not,
Tax,
it's not huge.
not much, okay? And if that makes a difference whether you can own one or not, you shouldn't have one.
It would depend on which taxing jurisdiction, I mean, what you pay on that $500,000 home.
Well, but you're not in a town though. You're gonna be in a county generally for those type of property.
Yes.
Okay, so your rate is a lot lower.
Let me grab,
Go ahead.
Representative Fern, then I'll go to you.
Thank you, everyone. I've asked a lot of questions. I know I've probably sent some 3 a.m. text to Representative Jones saying what would happen if, and I really thank the department for answering all my questions. Two things I want to just say is one, since I faced an election, I've been out on the campaign trail for the last 6 weeks or so. And as you can imagine, in my neck of the woods, the lack of housing and property taxes are the number one issue. You know, I think I'm a pretty fair guy. I explain this in the most objective fashion I can to house after house after house. And I can't say I've ever found a more popular issue and remedy, potential remedy, than looking at the relationship to second homes, short-term rentals. It's a big issue here. The second thing I would say is why I'm so strong proponent of this is I think it's very wise for us to look at the total portfolio we have of residential property in our state. And it's almost like a eureka moment, thinking like, why hadn't we think about this a while ago of applying this homestead exemption in quite this way? But to me, it totally makes sense to sort of bifurcate that 20% or so of residential property taxes and look at it for at least partially for what it is. I believe it's an extension of visitation and tourism. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's good. And I think, as been said from the meeting one, is that we're not going to have a sales tax, general sales tax. And we all want to find a way to maximize our take in a fair way from tourism and visitation. And I think if we consider this 20% of properties mainly an extension of tourism and visitation, I believe it adds more or less a value-added entity to our property tax collections. So I'm speaking more as a proponent philosophically of this. And I think that as we've heard, the devil lays in the details. I think the department can figure a lot of this stuff out. We can play around with 587 and such. But I think this does a shift in a pretty good way. I think it shifts it to where it needs to be. And around my neck of the woods, I can assure you, families aren't worried about their kids having the ability to buy a second home or their grandkids. They just want their kids to be able to have a home, have an apartment, have something affordable. And I really think this is a positive approach and that we ought to consider this very seriously. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Dave. BJ, do you have another comment? I just see your hand up, Rhonda. Okay, Senator Morjo.
Yeah, I want to be clear that I think we got to do this. It's just kind of figuring out the nitty gritty with some of this stuff. You know, to the director, to your comment on the renters, for me, I'm just not convinced that people are going to lower rent if they get a rebate. So for me, it would just be nice to find a way. I don't know how we do that. I think we got to put our heads together to find a way that ensures that renters are gonna see some sort of relief, because I think they take on a lot of that property tax responsibility from long-term rentals. And I, you know, to the short-term thing, I don't want to get wrapped around the axle on that. I just think that I do worry about someone like, you know, Grandpa Smith, who is retired and has a rental and is a fixed income, and $200 does matter to him. It's just a lot different than a hotel for someone like that who, and I know a lot of people like that around here who are lifelong Montanans. You know, they have a rental down the road from them on their property. And that's part of their passive income that they take in to be able to afford groceries and their bills. So, those are just like the types of people that I do worry about, and I just don't want to, them to feel like they're getting punished when they're the ones actually they paid income taxes in the Montana, or they are paying income taxes. I think the sentiment that Representative Fern mentioned with, the concerns for people to just have a place to live, affordable place to live, is what I hear too. That's predominantly what I hear. But I also think we're trying to protect everybody in this legislation, I think, or do our best to address as many concerns as we possibly can. And those are just some that I have heard and that I have. So I look forward to continuing to work with everybody on this, because I think we got to get something done on this front. So appreciate all of your work, you guys, really do.
Comment as well.
Yeah, I'll just, I'll note, and some of this I expect will become more clear as we go along. When we started this committee in the process, I was concerned that when we set off the sales tax, and we're not going to put that on the table, we're eliminating an alternative sort of revenue source. What you're left with doing essentially is moving the chairs from one side of the room to the other side of the room. And that's what we have to do here. But from a particularly the larger commercial side of this equation, I'm concerned about what sort of impacts will be on those larger commercial property taxpayers in the state. And that pool continues to shrink. And some of it goes to the evolution of our economy. As we go into more of a service-oriented economy and less of a bricks and mortar sort of an economy. You've seen it in Missoula County over the last 3 or 4 months, where we've seen some of the larger commercial property taxpayers in that community are in the process of disappearing. And that tax will be shifted onto others, both residential and the existing businesses that are there. And so it's easy to gloss over the larger commercial sort of guys, and you can put any sort of a household brand name with any of these large commercial operations that we have in the state. But my concern is that there becomes a big shift onto those folks. They're also providing the good paying jobs. They've been paying a part of the taxes in our community for a long time. And so I don't want this to be considered a dissent, considered a concern. And as we see this come into more focus, I'm trying to avoid the devil in the details cliche. We'll have a better understanding of it. But I am concerned about a shift that's going to take place onto those larger commercial taxpayers. We're already paying a very large share of taxes in their respective communities.
Valid concern needs to be fleshed out.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think this is probably where it is. It currently sets that it's going to potentially help about 350,000 renters and long-term folks. Up to a 15 to 20% reduction. It's going to help about 30,000 small commercial up to 3 million, and the cross line would be way above 3 million because it's the bifurcated rate. Before it impacted, you receive lower rates. To the extent we decide to create loopholes, we could leave all the small, we could leave short-term rentals out, and maybe we'd be down to a 14% or a 13% decrease. We could leave the bigger commercials out. Maybe we can give them a 5%. So again, there will be a shift. If you are going to rearrange the chairs and you're going to try to capture some out of state, you're going to try to capture some of that, without a doubt, there's a shift. That's impossible to avoid. The other shift is to shift it to income tax, and we all know the Montanans pay the income tax and outside don't. And so I do think this is, as we currently sit, the most equitable one we've been able to arrive at yet. And in every decision we make, we will hold a conversation of a shift. As we create exclusions, it's like every tax rate except for, well, we want to have bills capped except for. And each time there's an except for, you get to buy down owner dwellings and long-term rentals just a little bit less. And so that'll be the conversation in the debate. As it's currently formatted, it's about a 15 to 20% reduction. It'll move around from there depending what the department's new appraisal numbers come in and how many successful lobbyists lobby themselves out. And so that's where we sit.
I think this is probably, I don't like raising taxes on anybody, but what we have to work with, I think this is a very good model of protecting Montana full-time residents and reducing their taxes. I was concerned, the same as Todd was, about shifting too much commercial. I was pleasantly surprised with the way the model works, that it didn't have too large of an increase to them. It is a pretty good increase to second homeowners, and which in my district, which includes Flathead Lake, Knoxon Reservoir, a lot of mountains, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of calls from those second homeowners, but you know, my conversation, well, I'm trying to protect the primary folks here too. And you have a second home and you probably can afford that. A lot of them are non-residents also. But I think the way this also works is a lot of states will use a, you know, I should say about every state has a homestead. I think there's only one or two that do not. This is not a new concept. Some states use a percentage, like Utah, the first 45% of your personal residence is exempt from taxation. Even if you own a $10 million home up in Park City, that's 45%, but they have sales tax to backfill that. We're not doing that here. We're really helping the Montana resident homeowners do this. Some states have a flat dollar amount, and there's been others recommend in this state that let's just exempt the first $50,000 as a homestead exemption. Well, that $50,000 exemption in Fallon County is not the same $50,000 in Gallatin County. Gallatin County might cover your bathroom. So it's just unfortunate. You lived in Gallatin County, you might have bought a house for $200,000 and now it's worth, $1.5 million. But it's just your same old house you always had. So this is a good program, and to protect those low income individuals and the people, the fixed income folks. Remember, we have the PTAP programs that we'll have to discuss, and we can ride those on top of this too. And so you really protect those really individuals, low income, fixed income type people. So we'll have a second tier for them, and that can potentially help them out and also really protect those type of Montana residents too. The renters, I truly believe we're seeing a lot more apartments put up. You go to Missoula, Montana, Gallatin, a lot of them, when you reduce your property taxes on your rental property, those landlords, they want to have renters there long-term. There's nothing worse than have renters rotating in and out. So they will look at adjusting their rent, and the more the competition will drive that down. So I'm not concerned that the renters will not receive a significant impact on this type of program for those long-term renters. So I think it's a great program, and looking forward to seeing the reappraisals and getting this model where we can get it so it benefits the Montana full-time residents.
Chairman, I like simple things.
Yeah, this is definitely. Senator Morger, your hand's still up. So I don't miss you in case you were going to comment on something.
No, sorry, I just forgot to put it down.
Okay, just checking. All right, I don't see anybody else on the committee that want to pipe in on this. So obviously we're going to go ahead and move this forward as part of a recommendation. I guess before we go to public comment, I'm a little out of my agenda here, but we kind of adopted these as we went. If there's any concerns, I guess I'd like to hear about them. I think we've talked through most of these recommendations pretty thoroughly. So I'm going to assume, just based on these comments, this conversation today, that these recommendations will move forward. we will put that together in a more professional format for you than just single pages, and get that to you for your viewing pleasure for the next 3 weeks, probably.
Yeah, I think we sent out the placeholder for the 30th, I believe, this month, which we'd anticipate would be a Zoom meeting,
Right.
probably not in person. The second that we have at least a digestible draft of what would be a formal report, we'll get that out. We're also working with the Department of Administration right now with some of their professional copywriters to actually turn it into more of a professional document too. So it'll look much more like the housing task force, for example. But, as soon as we have some of those texts and drafts embedded in what kind of will start to look and feel like that final report, we'll shoot that out to you, probably give you up to maybe a week for review and any other fine tuning, and then we'll likely be scheduling something in the middle of August. Basically wrap this up for them.
I think that at the end of, the middle of August, that would be just kind of a brief meeting as well. Hopefully have the governor there. We need to coordinate the scheduling on that, so it won't be nearly as long as these meetings, obviously, so.
So once we get that draft, and you'll kind of give us instructions if we want to do some wordsmithing, send those, the recommendations to a certain individual, and you can get that in.
That's what you'll see from us. Just to verify, is Tuesday or Monday? Tuesdays are bad for you, is that correct? Can we do the Mondays at 29th?
Actually, I have something going on.
Oh, you do? Okay. So
Sorry, it doesn't all about me though.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to accommodate as many people as we can.
Sure.
And it should be Zoom. No physical attendance will be required on that day.
Yeah.
So it could be as short as even a half an hour.
Yeah.
Afternoon, Monday or Tuesday.
Tuesday afternoon?
Yeah.
Okay, should we shoot for 1 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, 30th? And we'll try to keep it to an hour. Again, I hope, we've kind of talked through these ideas, so I don't think there's going to be a lot to go over. Just verifying the format, wording, as Senator Hertz mentioned, and maybe going from there. Tuesday the 30th at 1 p.m. Okay. We're going to go on. If there's nothing further from the committee, I'm going to go ahead and go into public comment. We've got a few online. See if there's anybody in the room who'd like to talk. But let's actually start online this time. So I have Anna. Is that correct? Go ahead, Anna.
Hello, you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, my name is Anna Shemilinin. I live in Bozeman. And I will read from Frontier Institute.
Can you speak up a little bit, Anna? We're having a hard time hearing you right now.
Yes. Do you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah. So since 2018, total enrollment in Montana public schools only increased by 2%, but funding grew up 27%. Instruction and student services have gotten a smaller and smaller slice of the funding pie as schools spend more money on facilities and administration. A little below, for the 2022-2023 school year, 67% of 11th grade students didn't meet AST benchmarks in mathematics, and 54 of tested students fell below the AST benchmark in English language and arts, English language arts. So this data shows that taxpayers spend on school more and more money, tax money, while they receive no better, sometimes low quality of education. If we will talk about our general quality of life, more money we pay in taxes in Montana, less quality of life we have in recent years. So my point is that instead of looking how to shift already high taxes Montana's pay, the state should start thinking about more fiscal responsibilities. And while I am not a big supporter of state involved in regulating local governments, I think that it's a state's responsibility to require fiscal responsibility and accountability from school boards and local governments. We pay too many taxes already. And people in Montana, most of people in Montana, especially newcomers, they come here because we have great nature, we have very high, very good quality of life compared with other states, and we pay we have relatively low cost of life. It's changing, and when our quality of life fell below certain levels and our taxes will stay high, people will start leaving Montana. So Bozeman, for instance, has a very high chance to become a ghost city if they will not stop overspending and if they will not stop their policies, which basically drive people away. So this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Melissa Lewis.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Melissa Lewis, and I'm joining you today on behalf of the Montana Petroleum Association. Executive Director Dave Gall asked me to attend the meeting today and offer some perspectives on behalf of MPA. We've been listening throughout the interim here and paying close attention today. And as many have said, the devil is in the details. The Montana Petroleum Association is closely watching and awaiting such details. Of course, we do have some concerns about the outliers that have been mentioned with specific reference to pipelines and those eastern Montana counties and potential impacts there. One of the outliers that we wanted to make sure that everyone clearly understands is that within the centrally assessed properties, we've got Class 9. And Class 9 currently pays 12% of its market value. That is dramatically an outlier compared to the other classes of centrally assessed properties. So we want to make a note of that. And we also want folks to understand that these pipelines and our other members actually do pay payroll taxes and have income tax liabilities as well. So of course, we'll be paying close attention and communicating if there are any questions and dialogue that you'd like to offer. The Montana Petroleum Association stands as someone willing to engage in this conversation as the details appear on paper. We do want to just also mention that we love our cities, towns, and counties in which we live and work. We have a really good rapport with our units of local government and our schools. And, we take pride in training with career development opportunities, technical training. Hiring Montanans are the best workers that can work hard and long hours in the cold winter months. Our members are some of the largest employers in the state, and we do take pride in our presence in Montana. We can, continue to look for opportunities to grow and, improve our ability to work well with the state. And so we just want to make ourselves available to enter into these conversations and hopefully, our members won't be unfairly targeted in ways that could deter future investments. So that's what I would like to offer today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. Go to, Bob. Mr. Story.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I certainly appreciate all the work that members of the committee and the staff have done over the spring and summer on this issue. A whole lot of great information has been gathered and put together and analysis done. I'm going to start at the end and work back, I guess. The big issue, of course, is the Homestead-Comstead one. And I agree with Representative Jones and Senator Hertz that, of the options you have to work with, this is probably the best one out there right now. My concern is just that the numbers are you know, what they are. Everyone knows they're not real accurate just because the data isn't there. But I tend to agree with Ms. Wiggers that you can overpromise pretty easily on the tax relief that's happening here with the numbers you got. But I think in the end, has been alluded to several times in the committee that there's going to be a lot more residential property that qualifies for the lower tax rate when this becomes a more known commodity and the bill starts getting put together, and that will cause the numbers to skew. Either you'll have to raise the rate on the non-qualified property, or you're going to have a lot more mill shift than you're anticipating, which will again reduce the tax reduction for owner-occupied residential because their mill's going to go up, but it will also shift some onto, like Ms. Lewis talked about, properties with a higher tax rate, the centrally assessed properties, the utility distribution system, which passes that back through to homeowners in utility rates, the electrical generation system, the telecom system, all of those pay multiples in taxes per mill that a homeowner does. So, the shifting is important, but I think the real issue that's going to come to a head when this comes before the legislature is you're going to find out how many Montanans actually own second properties that their tax rate is going to go from 1.35 to 1.9% on, and that's going to be significant. It could be more than a couple $100 a year. My example that I've told you before is I have the home that we live in here on the ranch in Park City, and we have a condo that we have owned in Helena for 10 years now since I took this job, that we bought just because it made a lot more sense than renting a place to stay for the time that we have to be in Helena. Well, the taxes on both of those properties are about the same right now. And I'll get about a 15% reduction on my home here and a 46% increase on my home in Helena. And that's going to amount to about $100 a month on that small condo in Helena, just because of the differential in the tax rate, according to the current analysis. And that's with already some mill increases going on in Helena. I think your analysis that your model is vastly underestimates the amount of owner-occupied and long-term rentals that are going to be, especially in rural Montana, where you're predicting mill levy decreases, and those are going to flip and become increases also. But it's what you have to work with, and what's out there other than the other options, like has been talked about, just doing a straight rate reduction. Now, I just wanted to comment, from 1997 up until 2016, that's what happened, is the rate on residential property reduced so you were revenue neutral on a statewide basis. But that was done before there was ever any tax increase. So it really did, it created a shift in the fiscal world, but it didn't create much of a shift in the real world, because you were just maintaining the status quo in a lot of places. But anyway, that's that issue. On the education one, I think I have 2 points. First of all, we really believe that the 95 mills should float. If it was constructed properly with a floating mill there, you would have a standard general increase in revenue from the statewide equalization mills that could mirror what your increased costs were with the formula that growth that you give schools, and that could all be structured so it worked properly there. But if you leave that fixed at 95, what will happen is what happened in 2024 when you had a huge value in reappraisals. You had a huge windfall in state revenue, and none of that money at that time it flowed back to the schools. It just went into the general fund and off. It eventually went to schools and offset income tax money. So I still believe that if every other user of property taxes, which the schools, they have to float their mills when new value comes on. The cities and counties have to float their mills, at least to the extent of inflation. The reappraisal, they right now get newly taxable property, but I think that will get fixed if you do a 511 type of thing. It'll get some, but that my understanding of the equity lawsuit in 1993 never required the state to levy 40 mills statewide. It was just the state needed money to fulfill its obligation, and that's where they chose to get it. They didn't have the income tax money to pay for it, and they weren't willing to raise the income tax to get it, so they raised the property tax and shifted a lot of that to low mills, school districts and counties to help pay for the cost of funding schools. So that's a whole nother debate. But the county equalization levy is a concern also, I guess, because that's going to kind of do the same thing. It certainly equalizes things, but again, it takes money primarily from rural school districts and transfers it to urban school districts. Not necessarily making a better education system. It just takes money from those who can operate at a lower cost of tax dollars per student and making them help pay for those districts that have higher costs. And that's generally their more urban districts that have higher salaries and more teachers and more programs and things like that. So, I guess if that's what the legislature decides they want to do, to raise taxes on some people to lower it on others, that's a political decision that will have to be made at that point in time. The local government committee at least is working on lowering people's taxes, or at least limiting the growth in them, and so they've done quite a few good things. I just on the sunsetting levies every 10 years, I think, there's levies in Title VII, which are local government, city, county, special purpose district levies. And there's levies in Title VII, which are the education levies that Mr. Melton talked about, generally the levies that fund the base or above base funding, then 80 to 90%. And I don't think you want to put a limit on those. I think, in fact, actually, not too long ago, the legislature changed the law that schools used to have to vote those levies every year, and people got upset that why are you asking for new levies every year when they were really just asking for the same levy. And so the legislature, it's my understanding, let once those levies passed, they became a fairly permanent levy, and I don't know if you want to go back on that, but the current law that deals with these voted levies is 1510-4-25, and Senator Hertz talked about making one change to that, which is making all levies dollar amount levies instead of leaving the option for mill levies, and we agree with that. But in that same section of law, it says when those levies go on the ballot, they either go on as a permanent levy or a levy for a fixed period of time. And so currently, all those voted levies that go on out to get around the 1510-420 limits already have that in law. They either have to be for a permanent levy or for a fixed period of time. So if you want to take the permanent part of that away, I guess you could do that. And so Senate Bill 511, if you draft that, I would just suggest you work with how that interrelates with 1510-425, and which is the overrides law, and see that that works properly with what you want to do with whatever you come up with as a cap. And again, there's a cap on the largest user property taxes. That's school districts, capped by the formula that maintains equalization. There's a cap on cities and counties at the 1510-420, and there should be a cap on the state levy also. That's a significant levy in a lot of areas, and there's no reason that levy shouldn't be subject to the same cap or similar cap, some type of cap, and that cap should be structured so that that levy grows at whatever rate you grow the school funding formula. But you've done good work. It'll be interesting to see, I guess, where some of these concepts go as they actually get on paper and become bill drafts, so people know exactly what they're going to be. But the big concern is been alluded to with, especially the homestead comstat, is you're not going to really have proper numbers until mid-session or late session, and by that point in time, most of the hearings will be done, and this will all be figured out in the conference committee, I'm afraid. So thank you for your good work, and thanks for allowing for input.
Thanks, Bob. Go to Scott Pullbeck.
Oh.
Scott, you there?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Tax Advisory Committee. I first want to say you all have been working extremely hard on some very difficult and complex situations, and I believe you've come up with some solutions that will provide substantial tax relief for Montana. My comment is on the Tax Fairness Subcommittee recommendation, and our president, Cindy Johnson, did a good job of bringing up some of the concerns that Montana Farm Bureau has with regard to Montana's farmers and ranchers who own second homes, whether it's on their farm and providing affordable employee housing, or if it's just their second generation who's come back to the farm, but the farm owns the house. And I do believe that there's going to be workable solutions that can be written into the proposed legislation. And I specifically appreciate Representative Jones' comment. The intent of this recommendation is not to raise taxes on those Montana farmers and ranchers that are in a situation where they're providing housing or it's multi-generational housing. So we'll be looking out for that and want to make sure we don't disincentivize creating employee housing and multiple generations on the farms and ranches. One situation that may be a potential unintended consequence that I can see is that a lot of times on a farm or ranch, there'll be a house that's left vacant because family members passed away or they've left for a better job, et cetera. And currently, they're paying property taxes on that second home. It may be a situation where they're just leaving it vacant because it's not really economically in a place where it's attractive for long-term rental, or maybe they're waiting for another generation to come back and then they'll be able to occupy that house. Well, if it is unfeasible, if they're taxed at a higher rate on that, a lot of the times I can just foresee some of those older homes just being destroyed and taken off of the tax rolls altogether. So it's just an unintended consequence that I wanted to point out. But overall, again, I want to thank the members of this committee. I think you've done great work, and I appreciate all the time and dedication that you have put into this incredibly complex issue. So thank you.
Scott.
It's ready.
Okay, Matt.
Hi, thank you. Hope everyone can hear me well. All right. I'm a superintendent here at DeSmet Elementary, and so I'm going to go over three things quickly. The cost of a TIF district in real number terms, the process of making these huge TIF districts and the problems that we run into, and the cost that we're going to have in the future. And so like that meme that we see on Facebook that says, when did I ever need to know algebra? Today's today, you're going to need to know algebra. In 2018, we were able to have a TIF district that covered 1/2 of my school district sunset. The cost of our school district in mill levies in 2018 was 108 mills. In 2019, after the TIF was sunsetted, the cost was 77 mills. That's a decrease of 31 mills. That 31 mills is what the taxpayers inside the school district had to carry as a taxable burden for the 20 years that TIF district was there. There is those data pieces, if you want to look at them, are at OPI. The next one is that the new TIF district that that Missoula County has set up is so large that it encompasses 3 school districts, DeSmet, Frenchtown, and Hellgate. The issue is that the vast majority of that TIF district is in DeSmet. It covers the western half now of my school district. Missoula is going to create a city center with housing, and they're going to have a school. They're going to create all of this on vacant property that is outside of our school district. So DeSmet Elementary will be taxed to create housing and a city center and a school. There'll be a benefit. The TIF district will have a benefit for the school. All of that is outside of our school district. So all those students, all of that is going to be in Frenchtown. And that is something that our taxpayers are furious over. Why are we being taxed to support other school districts? And then finally, the permissive levy cost. We have 2,000 homes that will be outside of the school district. Missoula County has stated publicly that they'll be creating 10,000 homes in my school district. Those will be inside of a TIF district. Right now, we pay 32 mills for the school, and that's paid by the 2,000 homes. If we go to 10,000, we could multiply that by 5, and we get our 192 mills that have to be paid for the permissive levies, for tuition levy, for our handicapped children, for our retirement, for our transportation, those type of permissive levies. However, as a TIF district works, it's like twins. What you give to one, you have to give to the other. 192 mills, I have to give to one twin. 192 mills, I have to give to the other twin. In order to do that, I need to tax everybody in my school district 384 mills to split that cost. The cost of the TIF district in permissive levies alone will be 384 mills per household. That is unreal. That this is the type of program that we're going to use to build expansions within our city or city infrastructure. And the fact that we're going to do that by exploiting the children and the children of a school district is incognitive. And I believe there has to be serious legislation to address TIF districts and how they affect a school district. I tried to keep it under 3 minutes. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate everything that you're doing. And I look forward to visiting at a larger meeting with more detail if that's ever possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate the explanation. That's good. And I think Senator Hertz might be having a conversation with you about a larger meeting. Thanks again, Matt. Is there any public comment in the room? If anybody in the room that would like to. We've got everybody online. Good there. 2 minutes.
Never thought you'd.
Yes, Scott.
Maybe just to touch on the implementation. Homestead Comstead from our department perspective. Let's keep some very comments in that regard. Bryce, not sure.
Sure. I mean, the first
major concern we have is just the implementation date itself. Given our time frame for reappraisal, if this was to be stood up in 2025, that's not a lot of time by the time it'll probably actually get passed and signed on. But those little details were to implement. Be extremely difficult to get the entire thing stood up by the 2025. I mean, our first headline is due.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the room anymore.
Yeah, the main room is muted.
Can you hear now?
Yes. Sorry about that. No? Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
We could for a moment, but it was echoing.
I don't know what changed. I'll do this, you'll do that.
There
Are
possibly
we there?
Deputy Director? Oh, we can hear
Rhonda,
you now.
can you hear us?
It's got a terrible echo. Is there a possibility that Deputy Director Mendenhall could just put his concerns of implementation into writing and send them out to us?
Be recorded anywhere, so
Yeah, we just went to get IT. Oh, okay, he's not there.